up guys, Nick Wisdom with HeliDirect here to lead you through the build of the GOOSKY RS7 ULTRA. This is the latest version of the RS7 from GOOSKY. I think you're going to be really pleased. There's a number of great improvements in this kit. We'll talk about them kind of as we go through the build. If you haven't watched one of my builds before, I do an in-depth build through the entire process of the helicopter except for electronic setup. We will talk about wiring just a little bit. Setup will be covered in other videos on the channel of other helicopters, and there's lots of different setup videos on the HeliDirect YouTube channel you can reference for your particular FBL or ESC. All right. But this video will focus on the build. Now, in the description of this video will be a table of contents so you can jump around to different time codes. If you're just having a problem with the tail, you don't have to scan through the whole video, you can jump to that section and those will all be in the description below. All right, with that, let's go ahead and get into it. We'll be referencing the manual throughout. I'm gonna put this paper one aside. We're gonna reference the digital one and we'll jump there next. All right, first step of the manual simply has us putting together the thrust bearings into our blade grips, installing the blade grip arms onto there, installing the balls on the end of those, and then we're going to work with our radius arms and get those prepped next. So with that, let's jump to the bench and go from there. All right, here on the bench you can see I've gone ahead and laid out everything I need for our radius arms, our swash plate, blade grips, kind of everything coming up in the first few steps of the helicopter. Now, I'll probably follow the order of the manual throughout the build, but I may jump around and do things as I see fit. Now, first thing I always like to do is actually on the next page of the manual, and that's deal with our head block here, which, by the way, is beautifully machined. Now, not mentioned in the manual is that the helicopter comes with two different types of dampeners you can put in the head. So it comes with the 3 O-rings with the sort of hard plastic Delrin spacer that will go in last into the head, and you put in 3 on each side, plus the Delrin spacer, or a rock-solid rigid dampener made of what looks to be Delrin that will replace these 3. So it's either or, not both. Now, I have seen the RS7 fly with these hard, rigid dampeners, and it flies amazing, so that's the choice I'm going to make. The softer dampening you might prefer if you want it a little softer around center, not quite as fast and responsive, or if you generally don't prefer a rigid head. If you're not sure what you like, I would go with the O-rings over the hard rigid one, which is a little bit for slightly more advanced pilots. Although anybody can really fly either system, it's all personal preference. You can even try both in the air and see what you like. I'm going to go ahead and go with the hard plastic ones. If you do go with the O-rings, simply get just a tiny bit of grease on them, put a little bit of grease on your finger and get it inside the head, slide the 3 plastic pieces in, and then lastly slide the Delrin spacer in. Now we're going to put those aside and go with the hard Delrin dampener. You do want to use a little bit of grease. You can use any silicone food grade grease. Triflow makes a good synthetic grease. Doesn't particularly matter. Now I just put a little bit on my finger, and then I take my finger and just kind of get a very thin coating around on the inside. Now technically you don't need really the grease for the hard Delrin, but I like to put just a little bit in. It just keeps things, I don't know, I always feel better with a little bit of grease in the head. With that, take your spacers and they just pop right in, that simple. Boom. Okay, now, this block here that you can see that has a hole in the center of it, you can sort of see my hand through it, there we go, is the center pivot. And what you'll do is slide that into, and I'm actually going to put just a tiny thin, super thin coating of grease all around it just to help it pivot a little bit. Just a tiny, tiny amount spread thinly, and then you're going to drop it into the head block such that the hole here is so I can push the feathering spindle through it. So the hole runs horizontal, and then I will take my feathering spindle here and push it right through effortlessly. I'm going to go ahead and take my rag, wipe out any grease that managed to get on the tip here, and then any grease on the head block, and then we're just going to take that and stick it aside. So that is now good to go. Okay, our head block's done. Next thing we're going to do is take our blade grips and our blade grip arms, and we're going to go ahead. These, as you can see, there's this slight raised piece here. These just pop right over that. Wow, that's a really nice fit. And then we're going to take the 2 M3 screws and get some Loctite on those. Now, just to talk about Loctite for a minute, what I'm using is Loctite 243. This is a blue oil-resistant thread locker. And I take one of the 5,432 bags that come in the kit, and I use it to just pour a puddle of blue Loctite on. And then I'll take my driver, take the appropriate bolt, and I just dip it in the Loctite and rotate it a little. And then what I like to do is I take my finger and I roll the screw and I get Loctite evenly in the threads. I take the excess on my finger and then I'll just wipe that on a rag. I always keep some lint-free cloths on my bench for that. And then we're going to put both screws in. And again, a lot of what I cover will be basic if you've built a helicopter before, but I'm really targeting the first-time builders. So anytime there's more than one screw in an assembly, it's always a good idea to just loosely fit them until you have all of the screws in. Make sure the part is properly aligned, and then you'll send it home. It's also a good practice to, that's just sort of finger tight, and then I'm going to go just a quarter turn at a time, back and forth until I have these fully tight. And you don't want to tighten one all the way and then go back and do the other when you have multiple screws holding apart. It's always a good idea to go back and forth. And then I always like to take a rag, get any Loctite that I may have put on the part. Okay. That's that one done. We're going to go ahead and take the other blade grip and do the same. Go ahead and get this done and we'll be right back. Now, I'll caution that there are always more than one way to do things when building an RC helicopter. So if you have different ideas you want to share, feel free to share them in the comments as to how you like to do things. But keep in mind there's more than one way to do something. So your way may be your right way. This is my right way. There is more than one way to achieve the same task. Speaking of that, let's talk Loctite for a second. So there are a lot of different preferences when it comes to Loctite. Some people only use blue, some only use a tiny bit of red, green or retaining compound can be used on certain parts, and I'll talk through how I use Loctite as we go through the build. And this is one of those cases, so the ball that fits into the end of the grip arm here, if you ever buy a new grip arm, it comes with a new ball, and anytime we sort of have a feeling for how these parts will come when you order spares, that you're essentially permanently assembling it, I tend to use red Loctite. So I'm going to go ahead and get a little bit of a puddle of red going over here as well. And that's what I'm going to use on things like swash balls, tail control arm balls, different other parts as we go through the builds. Okay, so like I said, in this instance where we have a ball going into a blade grip arm, and it's always going to stay there, I use red Loctite, same method, put a little bit on the end, rub it into all of the threads with my finger, wipe the excess off, and then drive it home. And then wipe the excess off. Okay. Oops. Go ahead and get the other one done. We'll be right back. Now, as far as Loctite goes, a little goes a long way. You don't need a ton. That's why I get it in the threads, get all the excess out of there, and then wipe it off. Okay. That is our blade grips done. Incidentally, when I opened these from the package, I'm disassembling everything when it comes factory assembled for the most part. So I took all of the thrust bearings out and the extra radial bearing out of these blade grips, and then I have those all out down here. I will warn you that to get them out, it is a very perfect fit in here, so I did a lot of tapping on a softer surface to get the extra out. If they don't come out initially, you can always take a little heat from a heat gun on the outside of the blade grip, wrap it in a towel, tap it, and the bearings, the thrust bearings will just fall right out. So we've got our two blade grips ready to go. All right, now it's time to start working with our head block and our thrust bearings. So next up, we're going to make sure we have the thrust bearings in the right order. So the thrust bearing that's closer to the head block always has the larger inside diameter, or the inside of this circle here is larger. And the way you tell which that is, put it over the shaft. See how much that moves? That tells me that's the larger one. This one should be the smaller one and have a much tighter fit. In fact, it does. See how little that one wiggles? So I know this is the smaller one and it'll go on the outside. So since I'm building my stack on my driver here from the outside in, I've got my radial bearing, my washer. I'm going to take the smaller inside diameter and pop that on with just a little bit of grease on the one side. Now we're going to take our cup bearing, I got a lot of grease here, and we're going to fill every last bit of this. So I want to make sure we get lots of grease in here, fill all of the recesses on this bearing, don't leave any dry. If it is dry, get a little more in there, wait till you get it all packed in. Okay, get some on the back side, and then that'll go with the cup facing towards the inside of the grip. Now, there are some theories as to which way these should go. I always do it with the cup facing the inside. Take the other thrust bearing with the larger inside diameter, that goes on last. Now, I like to get all the grease off my fingers. This is a full contact sport, so got to get some grease on your hands. And then we take our blade grip here, and then we just use the driver to work all of these in. And then we can just push down on this radial a little bit, get it all packed in. That is that blade grip good to go. Just push that in just a little tighter, there we go. All right, now do the same thing in the other grip in the same reverse order, and then we'll be back and we'll get them joined with our head block here. Okay, we got our stack ready for the other blade grip. Same time process. Now, I should mention from the factory, there was a little bit of grease on these thrust bearings. I always like to put my own on and make sure it's fully packed, so I went ahead and did some more. Just going to make sure there's not a ton of extra grease here. If there is any sort of sploogeon out, I'm just going to pull it out with a driver. Clean that off. What I don't want is this feathering spindle here going through a bunch of grease and getting a bunch of grease in these threads. Another trick you can do is cut the head of a Q-tip, tap it in each end, and that'll help keep grease out as well. But I've got these cleared out pretty well, so I'm not worried about it. So we're just going to take our feathering spindle, and there is no spacer that goes in between here. Sometimes on some helicopters you'll see a washer or a spacer in here, not on the RS7 Ultra. And we're just going to slide the feathering spindle till it comes through. You'll see the top come right there. And then you have a screw or bolt and a washer left to go. Now, I don't clean with alcohol most of my bolts. Now, I don't clean all of my bolts with alcohol, but I do clean several key ones. Now, Loctite 243 is meant to work in oily environments and still hold. So the oils that are on the screws that come from the factory are fine to leave there if you use the right oil-resistant Loctite. However, really important bolts like spindle bolts, I will spray a bunch of alcohol on a towel. I will take the bolt in a driver, in which case this is a 5mm, and I will spin the bolt in the wet part of the rag, and I'm going to do this with both bolts for either end of our feathering spindle. And these are actually really clean. You can see there's not much dirt in the rag here, just a little bit, but it's always good to get it off and then just let those sit for just a few seconds. You can usually go back to the first one you clean just so that alcohol burns off. And then I like to pop the washer on it. Actually going to get a little Loctite on it first, so I'm going to roll it in this huge amount of Loctite, run it across my finger. I'm getting Loctite in all of the threads, all the way up and down the bolt. I want this thing to really grab, but then I'm going to wipe all that excess off because I don't want, even there's some at the base of the bolt, I'm going to kind of rub off. I don't want a lot of extra Loctite floating around inside the head. So come back to the bench, and we're only going to loosely tighten this at this point because we'll tighten it when we get both blade grips on, and we'll tighten them against each other. So I'm just going to kind of quick finger tighten this until the feathering spindle just starts to spin, which is what will happen. Now make sure you get the text side up on this side. The other blade grip is going to go this way, so the text is up on both sides. So same thing on the other side. We will just work it gently down the feathering spindle. You may see the other side start to pop up, in which case just kind of put a driver on it and use it to kind of push things down on the bench. And then get the other driver in here as it finds the hole between all the bearings. Okay, make sure you got everything on the right side here with all our text facing up all the way across. And then we're going to go ahead and get Loctite on our other. Now you will need two 5mm drivers working on opposing sides against each other here. So same thing, bunch of Loctite on our bolt, work it into all the threads, pop the excess off, see all that extra. That's why I like the big tube of Loctite, because I wipe so much extra off, so much of it ends up in my towel. All right, so I'm going to take the bolt and we're going to work opposing the other driver. So we're just tightening against that one right now. And this is where you want to make sure you have all the grease off your hands. We're going to take both drivers and run them against each other. So You don't have to go crazy tight with this. You want to put a decent amount of force, but you don't have to go insane. Now here's the fun part. Did you do things correctly? If you did things correctly, this is going to feel butter smooth, but most important, try and pull it apart and push it back together. If you can feel any play as you pull this apart, push it back together, if you feel like tick, 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 and it's coming in and out, then that's not good. So what you want is no play, which is what I have right here, and smooth movement. And to me, one of the best signs of smooth movement is it's really easy to rotate with my hand, but it doesn't fall under its own weight. I don't want it so loose, that tells me that something's wrong if it falls under its own weight, but if it's really easy, and wow, this is smooth. It's always a good sign when you get this far, and both blade grips, head or tail, move really freely. All right. Let's go ahead and see what's next. I think we're going to head to our radius arms. All right, so now we're going to work on our radius arms. Now, this bearing, this spacer, and this bearing have already been pressed into the radius arm by the factory, so those are good to go. The washout arms, same thing. The bearings and spacer are already pressed here, so really what we just have to do is grab this bolt and this washer here and get these prepped. Coming over to the bench, they give you 4 of these tiny washers, so put 1 on the head of the bolt. Now we're not going to put Loctite on this yet. Now, we are going to pay very close attention to the text. Make sure it is upright, saying legend here. So, I'm going to build this in my perspective here. So the bolt is going to go, in this instance, we take our radius arm with the flat part kind of here. The bolt with a washer comes through from this side, goes through, and then with our text saying legend, upright, it now goes into here. What I like to do in this instance is I just barely started the bolt, so you can see I've just kind of, there's still a ton of play here, and I've left this cavity open. I'm going to take an awl, which is essentially just a tiny metal pointy stick, dip it in our Loctite, and I'm going to work Loctite into the threads of the receiving part here. And this guarantees that as this bolt tightens, what will happen is that will get coated in Loctite. So we'll go ahead and take a driver. It's really important to not over tighten these right here because there are a lot of bearings and moving parts in this assembly. So snug it up, give it a little bit of extra. You can see it pushed all the extra Loctite out of that assembly the other way, away from the bearing. And we'll just clean that off. And then this particular setup is now good to go. The way you can tell it's right is if you have the upright text and then you rotate, so upright text like this, rotate this way. This outside should also have text on it. It says GOOSKY here. So if this is upside down and you've got no text, you've got this recess, but the text was right side up, you know you got it wrong. So right side up here, rotate it this way, GOOSKY should be written right there. All right, we're going to go ahead and make the opposite side of this right now with the other set. And what I mean by opposite is it looks like so. So we have our text upright here from my perspective here, and we have our piece here. This is going to go like so. So upright from my perspective, GOOSKY written here. So bolt comes in from that side and we'll screw into here. Again, just get it started, grab our Loctite, work it into these threads. The best part about this is the bolt is a stopper, stopping the Loctite from getting into that bearing in there. So we just work it around in there and then tighten it the rest of the way. Now, if I did this right, it's going to look like this. So GOOSKY text here and here. If I rotate this one, it's upright text. If I rotate this one, it's upright text. So these are now good to go, and they will sandwich the rotor head when we get to that step. All right, next step, building links. Not my favorite, not anybody's favorite. So for now, we're going to build 2 of these. We take 4 of our ball links, and if you have an awl, or you can use a driver for this as well, there is a hole in the linkage rod. And you just put your driver through it, and it means that when we spin our links on, it'll hold it from rotating. Now one side of these is reverse thread, and I can never remember until I start it. So we'll just go ahead and start. Looks like the longer side might be reverse threaded. It is. Okay, so the side with the longer stem here is reverse threaded. So we're going to go ahead and, now this is a tool I have from another kit, but a lot of kits will give you balling tools. You can just use it to speed things up, make things a little easier on your fingers. The goal is to get this at about 70.35 millimeters. However, in the manual, they also give you a 1-to-1 printed drawing you can put it over the top of. So that's one way to do it. I'm just going to get this kind of started, and then I'll flip to the other side. So if it was reverse threaded on the other side, this side will be traditional thread. So, okay, running the way I like to build my links is with a digital caliper. So I'm going to go ahead and set this. I always bring it together, zero it, and then we're going to 70.35 millimeters for overall length. 70.35 on the button. I'm not going to lock that down, so this size won't change as I build my two links. And then we'll just go ahead and check how we're doing here. We've got to come in a fair ways, so let me go in some more. Okay, and the links are going to be 90 degrees to each other, according to the picture in the manual at least, which means one will be this way, the other will be horizontal. All right, 70.35 across these just like so. It's a little tight this way, but if I come in another turn and get things in the right orientation, it's a little loose, so I'm going to kind of split that difference right there. And that's pretty good. All right, now I just have to match the other one. All right, I'm going to get this other link built, and then we'll be back. Okay, now we've got our two links, both exactly the same size. We can tuck those aside. All right, now if you look at the manual here, you can see this is where they do the feathering spindle and put the grips on that I've already done. Here we're just going to put our what's affectionately called the Jesus bolt, because it's very important that you have it in the helicopter, as well as our two pinch bolts. And we're going to go ahead and mount the rotor shaft to the main shaft. So the main shaft has two holes and a little flat spot here. The head is going to go in the hole that is closest to the end. The other end has a hole that's like a solid inch or so. We're going to go for the one that's almost at the end. And we're going to take our rotor head and slide it through, looking through the hole. And that's nice. It bottoms out perfectly lined up. I know that's probably hard for you to see. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is get this Jesus bolt put through. You'll notice, and it's probably really hard for you to see, there is a flat spot here. That side will be for the nut, because it'll actually stop the nut from spinning. So we're going to go ahead and insert the bolt from the side that has the circle recess in it. So insert the bolt. Now make sure before you do anything that you have in fact captured the main shaft. It is possible to put the bolt on top of the main shaft and not capture it, and then your rotor head comes off on the maiden almost instantly. That's very bad, obviously. All right, so just start the nut with your fingers and then push it into the recess with your thumb. Grab your 4mm driver and you can start to tighten the bolt, and those little ridges on that side will stop. Now, I'm going to keep this loose because I don't like to tighten the Jesus bolt first. I like to tighten these pinch bolts first. We'll go ahead and take our pinch bolts out just so we can get Loctite in here. There's one, flip it over, get the other. And then here's how we're going to do this. Don't need Loctite on all the threads because it's really only the first part of the bolt that does all the work here. And then we'll slide it through. I'm only going to finger tighten this. So, and I'm going to pay attention because what I want to do here is tighten both of these bolts perfectly evenly. So I'm just going to snug it until I start to feel resistance and stop right there. And I'm going to go ahead and set the next bolt after that. Same thing, I'm going to go ahead and snug this. Now I'm going to do about a quarter turn on each side, continuing to flip it after each quarter turn. And what this does is it ensures that I am evenly grabbing the main shaft in the head block, and that it's not leaning to one side, because you don't obviously want this to be off. Now, it is difficult the way GOOSKY has designed this head to be off at all here. You could probably tighten it in any order and it would be fine, but this is just a best practice. Okay, that's great. And then only once I have both of those pinch bolts tightened do I come back, don't forget, to the Jesus bolt, and I'm going to give this not a ton of force, but a good amount. I want that to not come off. You should be able to hammer a nail in this thing at this point. Okay, all right, next, back to the manual. We're going to deal with the swash in a minute, but we're just going to go ahead and get our follower arms in here. And you can see, again, they've shown you where the text is here. and which side these washout arms are on. All right, let's go ahead and get that knocked out. So with each of these, we want a bolt with a washer. I've already gotten the washer on the end of the bolt. It goes through the arm, and then another washer goes on before, oops. Careful with these. If you drop them, you will never ever find them again. They will disappear to another dimension if you drop them. So I'm just prepping these for now. Haven't done any Loctite yet. Okay, those now have the bolts and the washers in them ready to go. And you'll see that this will go in on this side here, and then on, so it'll be the left side on both. So first we're going to go ahead and get a little bit of Loctite in there. I'm going to use my method with the awl again because I don't want any Loctite getting in that bearing. So I'm just going to put just a little bit there, a little bit there. A lot of it comes off on the end of the awl again. And then before I even drive the bolt in, I will clean off all the extra Loctite, most of which will get pushed out the back side. Now, being very careful that I don't drop those tiny washers, we'll go ahead and get the bolt started by hand and then tighten with the driver. Again, don't go crazy on the force on these. This arm needs to move freely. If you over tighten this, the bearings will get crunched and then they will not work reliably. And you need them to. Same thing here, I've already got Loctite in this hole. Make sure they move freely. And then you can kind of pull this direction on them and just make sure there's no play. That means you've got it tight, so that's good to go and it moves freely. Same thing on the other one. No play in and out, moves up and down freely. All right, that's our rotor head. Let's move on to the swash. And then, now, this is your swash plate. Now, any swash plate in any helicopter, ooh, that's smooth the way that ball moves. You should assume that none of these bolts have Loctite and none of this is tightened. This is one that a lot of folks miss, including these 4 bolts on top we're going to check, as well as these 3 bolts on the bottom. And then every single one, you can see there's 0 Loctite on here, nor is there meant to be any. And we're going to go ahead and work on that. Now, I don't recommend you remove all of the balls. I tend to do it just kind of one at a time and Loctite them and put them back because some helicopters have a different size ball here and here versus here and here versus here. And you never know. I mean, you can look at the manual and figure out all the parts, but it's easier to just kind of go one at a time and then keep very careful orientation. I always sort of work inside out. So I'm going to do these 4 bolts on top first and then these 3 on the bottom and then work in order here. So 2mm driver for these. Yeah, no Loctite on these top bolts here. And then this is going to get boring real fast, so I won't make you sit through all of this, but I'm going to go ahead and pull these 4 bolts out, get Loctite, and then put them back in. Do not over tighten these bolts either. The only thing I will say when you're doing things like this is work in a direction. So I'm going clockwise here. So I'm going to be sure and keep the orientation of the swash plate and not rotate it. And then I work on these bolts in a clockwise fashion so that I make sure I get them all. Because what you don't want to do is get 3 out of the 4, miss one, and then regret it later when something comes undone, especially when we get to the swash balls that are driving your links. Okay, now we're going to flip the swash over and do these 3 bolts on the bottom. Now I did feel some resistance there, so it's quite possible these are Loctited at the factory. Watch out for the washers. Nope, don't see any on here. Don't forget to put the washer there. Make sure you get a lot of this Loctite off. You don't want Loctite getting in the edge of the bearing here. Same thing going clockwise, moving to the next one. Sure you get that washer in there. Not a lot of need to tighten these a ton. If you feel resistance while driving any of these bolts in, stop. You're probably cross-threaded. Don't force anything. Now, this little bolt here, really important you grab this. What it's doing is it's pinching this clamp together, which holds in the bearings into the swash plate. Really important that we pop this out and get some Loctite on it. Also really important we don't over-tighten this. We just need it to be able to retain the bearings. Okay. Don't go crazy tightening that. We just want to make sure everything moves and everything can rotate freely. If you start feeling things not rotating, then there's a potential you've over-tightened a little bit. You can always just back that screw off of here. Okay. All right. Now we're going to move on to the balls. I'm going to work outside in going to orient things down with our alignment pin, and we're going to start at the 3 o'clock position. And I'm going to use red Loctite on all of these swash balls because if something happens that's so bad it wrecks the swash, I'm going to be replacing them all anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and use red, and these will be locked in forever. Now there's one. I'm going to go to the 6 o'clock position. Again, remember the order you went in and keep it in the same orientation, or whatever works for you to remember which ones you've done and which ones you still have to do. If you forget, just take them out. You'll see the Loctite on the threads. Don't guess. Okay, moving to the 9 o'clock, and then lastly the 12 o'clock position. Okay, you might be able to see there's a little bit of squeeze out of Loctite, so I always run around with a rag and just kind of give each swash ball a quick wipe. Okay, now we're going to do the outside balls. I'm only going to put red on this one and this one. This one we're going to use with blue because sometimes you have to take it out. Now the difference between red and blue Loctite is the hold. Blue Loctite will release its grip easier than red Loctite will. Red Loctite often requires heat in the form of a heat gun or blowtorch to increase its viscosity so that you can break the bolt, not, remove the bolt, unscrew it. Blue, however, just has a strong resistance and then it'll pop. So any bolt you want to be able to remove for service regularly, or say is on a part of the helicopter that you might crash and need to be able to remove it and replace it, you should use blue Loctite on. Any sort of mission critical bolt like swash balls, such like that, you will want to use red Loctite on because you don't want that thing ever coming out. All right, last one, the alignment guide. Okay, always give your swash plate just a look over one more time. I got these 4 bolts. I got inside ring, outside ring. I got the pinch bolt, kind of spin it, check all the bolts, and I got these 3 bolts, and I don't see any other bolts on the swash. It's even just missing this one bolt here that pinches this ring, can cause a catastrophic crash. So, all right, with that, our swash plate is good to go. All right, before we join these two, let's just take a look at our swash plate. Do you see how on the inner ring there are these sort of outcroppings here that push the balls a little further out? Those are going to go to our main control links, main drive links. And then the balls that are closer to the swash are what's going to go to our follower arms. So now that we know that, we pop the swash on, and we can take our follower arms, rotate the swash such that we get one of the shorter balls here, and just pop these on. Let's see if these go by hand or whether I'm going to need my, oh, those are a nice tight fit. These are the Lynx balling pliers, which you can't buy anymore, but Steam makes a nice set, as well as some other brands. So definitely want a set of these in your inventory, and we're going to use these to push the radius arms onto our balls on the swash. First one's always a little tricky while you try and get things to hold still. All right, there's one side done, second side done. All right, so now that'll at least capture our swash, and then we take our main drive links. Now, in all of my videos, somebody yells at me and tells me these are upside down, right side up. Let me tell you something. It doesn't matter which way I put these. I always turn it the wrong way first, no matter what I do. So I just don't care. As long as I'm going from the correct side of the swash to the right side of the blade grip, I just don't care. So do keep in mind, see where the text says GOOSKY on this link? That's the side you want facing out. The other side goes against the ball. So we'll take this here. Get this first one on. That's on, not quite on yet. There we go. And then same thing, check this link is on the correct orientation. Pop that on, there we go. Do the same on the other side. Check the orientation every time, because if you put a link on backwards, it stresses things and you might have to replace the link, and you don't want to have to do that. Okay, so there we go. Our swash is good, our follower arms are good. So again, the main drive links go on the inner swash piece that juts out, and then your follower arms go on the one closer to the inner ring of the swash. All right, with that, we have ourselves a rotor head with our swash plate. All right, we can now put this aside. We won't come back to this for a little while. All right, next up, we're going to do a couple of sub-assemblies here. We're going to assemble our main gear. Now, the main gear comes assembled from the factory loosely, but we're going to take it apart at least to the point where we remove these bolts, and then we will get some Loctite in here as well as oil our one-way bearing. And if you do happen to take it apart, there is a nice drawing here to help you figure out the correct orientation to put it together. But if you just leave it in the orientation it was when you carefully disassemble it, you'll be good to go. And then we're also going to take this mainframe plate and move this is what will capture the main shaft with two nice big bearings here. These are double row angular contact bearings, nice and beefy ones. So we'll get these two bearings, this lower plate as well, and then our front tail belt pulley support looks like here. All right, so let's go to the table now. Let's get this main gear done and get it out of the way. So this is the orientation. It comes from the factory. So these were screwed together through the main gear. This main gear is beefy as can be, by the way. It's beautiful. We'll take our main gear. Now the silver side here with the one-way in it is going to go into the side with the recess in it. So I'm going to go ahead and fish that through. I'm getting oil all over my main gear here. Oops. Keep our one-way in the right orientation here. Kind of rotate these to the correct orientation. Try and keep it straight as it goes into here. Okay, that's good to go. Then we take a red plate here with the little sort of crown ridge going up. Line that up there, and that will capture things. So that will hold things in as it falls out the bottom. It's funny how it was tight a second ago, and now it just falls out with gravity. But once we get one of these bolts started, it'll be good to go. No Loctite on this first bolt. I'm just going to quickly thread it in just so it stops apart from falling out. So that first bolt is going to come out as soon as I get the first real one in. Okay, so I'm going to kind of get the oil off of my fingers so I'm not getting oil on these. Only really need Loctite on the very end. So that's the part that'll contact some threads. Take our bolt. This is another situation where we're going to go just till we feel resistance and stop. I'm going to take out that first bolt that was just temporarily holding those halves together, get Loctite on that before I forget. And same thing. Tighten till it captures, stops. All right, I'm going to get the other 3 bolts in. Okay, now that we have all 5 bolts in, just kind of finger tight, we're going to do the same thing, except now we're going to go in a star pattern. So we go diagonally across, kind of like, imagine you're drawing a 5-pointed star. And we're just going to follow that pattern as we tighten, and this will ensure that things stay evenly tight as we go around. Keep in mind that the gear between these 2 halves is just plastic, although a very heavy-duty plastic, but you can over-tighten and crack things, so don't go crazy. And you'll feel kind of all these bolts will start to come to their final tightness around the same time. All right, main gear's done. We can take this aside. Now, you'll notice that I have gone ahead and taken all of the bolts out. When you get these from the factory, they're in bags, and all of the screws are in them, which will help you know which screw goes in which spot, but I tend to take it all out just so I can put the video together a little faster. So your kit will have everything sort of pre-screwed into here. So first things first, these bearings in here, looks like they already have bearing retainer on them. I cannot get them out. So these have been factory retained by the factory, so even though it tells you to put green Loctite, they've already done so. We're going to assume the text will be, I'm trying to see if there's an up and a down to this part. It doesn't look like it. It looks like it's completely symmetrical, so we're good there. All right, one of the nice things about a digital manual is you can zoom in really far. And you see this little piece right here? In order to tell which way is up on this upper plate here, you have to zoom way in, and you can see that this little tab should be sticking out that way. So back to the bench, you can see that same tab right here, and it's going to sit on top here and very tightly fit that way. And then we'll take some 2.5 by 6s and attach it. Again, same thing here. I'm only going to finger tighten these initially because I want to not torque it. I want it to stay dead level. So I will also tighten these 2 bolts kind of the same way, back and forth method. Okay, that's that. Same thing from the bottom with this plate here. Bottom plate, same trick. Let's zoom in on the digital manual. You can see this complex shape area right here, and make sure that we get this in the right orientation. So with this little recess here, with this little step in the right spot. So here's that little recess here, flat. These come together. A little bit of a tight fit here. I'm going to line up the screw hole, rotate it a little bit, and then take our 2.5 by 6s and join that part. And you'll know you have it the right way because the recess for the screws will be on the bottom. Next up, we're going to focus on this long assembly of this front pulley. Okay, we're going to follow the manual closely here. So we take our long bolt here. It goes through the block. Now the block has a little recess in it. The bolt will go into that recess so it sits almost flush once it's fully tightened. So we take that, then we take our spacer. The manual shows a brass one. It's actually silver is what came in my kit. And then our bearings have already been pressed into the pulley. That comes next. Then we take the bushing, just the silver spacer essentially, put that over. And then we are good to go. So I will put that on a driver. Now, in this instance, I'm going to use the awl trick to get the Loctite on. So I've got a little bit of Loctite on here, and I'm just going to spin it around the end of the exposed thread because I don't want a ton in the bearing. And then keep that on the driver. And then we will mount it in this back left hole. Okay, make sure that the bearings can still move freely. And interestingly, when it's tight, this little block piece here, which should be oriented towards the outside of the frame, so kind of get it spun that way, so it's flat, like so, and then tighten it. We might have to come back to the screw, loosen it a little as we negotiate this part. But okay, great. Okay. Okay, another new subassembly. Looks like the lower bearing block, which is the third, which is this guy here with the bushing. Now, this bushing just pops right out of this bearing, so pay attention to orientation. I'm going to go ahead and loosen these bolts, get them out of our way. I like to keep the bolts I take out in sort of piles so I know what they're associated with, and I keep tabs on them. But I know we're going to end up using all of these pretty soon, so I'll keep them close. All right, this is one the manual doesn't call for, but I like to do. Whenever I have sort of one of these bushings in here, inside a bearing, I green Loctite these in. So I'm going to put a little bit of green, and I mean a little bit, around this, and then reseat it back in the bearing in the same orientation it was in. So I'm going to take my awl, clean it off. I'm going to get some green retaining compound. This is Loctite 609, meant for holding bearings in place. And what I'm going to do is take this bushing, tiny bit of green Loctite on my awl, and I'm going to use the awl to spread the thinnest of coats all the way around this bearing. It does not take much to hold it in place. I don't want a lot because I don't want it splooging out all over the place and getting everywhere. And then I'm just going to push it back in the bearing. And that just ensures that when this spins, the next surface of the bearing it's in contact with spins with it. It's merging those together. And if this bearing ever goes, I'm going to take the whole thing out anyway and replace it all, so not a big deal. Okay, so that third bearing block is good to go there. And you can see we're going to grab our, this is the FBL plate that your gyro will mount to. There's these little dampened mounts in here that help reduce vibration. We're going to get our two boom clamps, and then there's another measure to reduce vibrations coming from the tail by using this rubber isolating sleeve. So let's go ahead and put that together. Quick tip here, on the pinch bolts in a boom clamp, I often like to get Loctite on here early on. Some folks like to wait, but I would rather have Loctite on early than forget to have Loctite when I come back to tighten this. So I get a little bit on that bolt. If I add a little more later, great, but it's nice to just know that there's a little on there now. Okay, now, telling the difference in these tail boom clamps, you can tell which one is the furthest rear because it's got the rubber insert in it already from the factory. And then if you look at the picture, you can see I'm looking at smooth sides initially. So this is going to be this orientation like this. So our pinch bolts will be both on this back side as I rotate them this way, and then we're going to go ahead and get them mounted to our plate here. Now, this is a little bit of a fiddly step here, so this is how this is going to work. I'm going to go ahead and get some Loctite in the threads of this lowest part using my awl. You could put it on the bolt here too. It's nothing mission critical. I'm just going to put it at the lower piece here so I don't have to fiddle with it. Okay, got my Loctite prepped. Got my side with the rubber towards the back, and here's where it gets fiddly because we're going to stack a bunch of stuff. So this is our tail boom mount plate, and then we have our FBL plate here with the hole towards the back, and then we have these inserts here that are the dampeners. They're sort of a hard plastic dampener, so it's not a soft rubber one. So if you've had helicopters with soft rubber dampening before, make sure you get the recess in this top plate such that the screw sits flush. So I'm going to go ahead and get these on, kind of put my fingers on them. Then I'm going to put these plastic inserts on top here and here. Then I'm going to take this piece. I might have to do all 4 of these, it looks like. This is going to be extra fiddly. All right, so see if I can get 4 of these at once with the dampeners. This is a fun step. Kind of get all this sandwiched and hold together here, because then we got to get it through the next plate. Once we get all 4 of these screws through here, things will get a little easier to hold. All right, there's 3 through. There we go. So now I've got, you can see all 4 screws through. I've got my fingers on them on this side, but now at least I can sandwich them, so I can now pinch this plate like this, and as long as I keep this upright, our screws aren't going to come out. And then I'm going to triple check the orientation, make sure this is the one it's not, with the rubber in it that goes towards the back here. Got my pinch bolt coming out this side, and we're going to get these in here. Just going to loosely tighten these to start holding things together. We'll tighten them all once we have both plates in. Pinch bolt, right orientation. There we go, getting there. Definitely a little bit fiddly. Kind of get it oriented that way. All right, now we can go ahead and get these home. Now obviously you don't want this loose because your Flybarless unit's going on top of this piece. Wouldn't you know it? Look, top plate, wrong orientation. This hole should be back here. I don't think it really matters, but I'm going to go ahead and fix that now. All right, now that I have this the right way with the hole towards the rubber inserted tail boom clamp, I'm going to go ahead and snug these down. Now don't over tighten these onto these plastic inserts. Just snug them and give them a little bit extra. But you don't want to crush those. Okay, there we go. There is our tail boom clamp assembly. Back over to the manual here. It looks like we've got what looks like our ESC plate and then another front plate with a couple of mainframe connection blocks to just drive some screws through. Not much to note here, just make sure that the recesses for the screws are in the correct alignment and that these blocks are in the correct alignment as well. All right, starting with our ESC plate, just make sure you get this little cutout facing down. That one's going to go there. Now, one of these has, actually they both have 3 holes across the top, so they made it easy on you. You'll notice there's not a hole here, but there is here, but both clamps have 3 holes. So we'll go ahead and get the first one all set, and we'll just get some Loctite on these, and then the usual drill, we'll get all 4 kind of roughed in, and then we'll tighten all 4 home. Okay, got all 4 screws tightened here with our little plates here. Now one of the things that's nice, and this is true of every part of the whole helicopter, is they've softened the edges of the side frames and all the carbon parts, which is a really nice touch of GOOSKY. So more of that from more manufacturers, please. It's awesome. All right, we're going to take this other front plate, get our rails set for that. Again, just make sure that the recess for the screws is in the right orientation. All right, and that is our other front plate with our 4 screws mounted. Let's see what's next. All right, looking at motor mounting here, there's kind of a long page in this manual. Let's look through it from the top. So our motor, which will be one of the last things we insert, will go into this assembly. We've got our motor mount plate. These 4 bolts will bolt up into the motor. These 2 bolts, which will need to be done first, however, bolt down into what they call the motor concentricity holder, but essentially it's the guide that holds the bearings and the motor pinion, which will slide up into here. It's captured on both ends by 2 bearings. We're going to go ahead and get a little bit of green Loctite on the inside of each of these. I like to make sure that there's great contact between the pinion and these bearings. And then finally, the whole thing is secured by these 2 screws that hold this bearing into the motor mount here. And you can see here there's a little reminder from GOOSKY here saying don't over tighten these guys at the bottom. If you do, it can impede the motion of this bearing, so make sure that everything rotates freely when you're done. Motor. What did I choose? I went with the EcoDrift 4730 EC 540 kV motor, which is a fantastic choice for this helicopter. Honestly, the 4730 series from EcoDrift is my all-time favorite motor for a 700 size helicopter. I love this thing. It's efficient. It pulls like a freight train. It's got tons of power and torque. It's just my favorite for a 700 size. So I've gone ahead and I pre-soldered on my motor bullets. You'll want to do that at this point before you get the motor in. Now it is also important, because I solder and do all kinds of wire work on this bench as well, that I stop this motor from coming into contact with wire shavings. So I usually keep my motors in a bag as I work with them on the workbench, because there's little bits of wire and screws and things I don't want getting pulled into this gigantic magnet. And it's a lot easier if they stick to a magnet on the outside of a plastic bag I can just take away than if they get sucked inside the motor and I got to take the thing apart. So before you put it on your bench, keep it in a bag. All right. Okay, we got that stack apart. I'm going to take these 2 bolts out of the top that are going to attach this piece to our motor mount plate. All right, so GOOSKY has not put any green Loctite on this. You can see that this pinion can move freely up and down. Obviously it's not attached to the motor shaft yet, but even these bearings are popping in and out too. So let's get these 2 bolts tightened next. I'm trying to figure out the order of things, because as you look at these parts for the first time, you got to say, what do I want to do first? And I think this is the key to get these 2 bottom bolts. Keep an eye on these tiny little washers down here. We definitely need those. And this is another place we want to be really cautious with the amount of Loctite, because there's a lot of rotating parts that we want to rotate freely here. So I'm going to get a little Loctite in here, push it into the threads, remove as much as I can with my finger, throw the washer on here. Yeah, see how that bearing just popped right out? We're going to go ahead and green Loctite this bearing as well. Just trying to get this bearing off of the pinion. It is a nice tight friction fit, which might make me feel better about not green Loctiting that part. And that's a nice firm friction fit. Friction fit is fine as long as there's a lot of friction. What I don't want is for it to freely turn. So I'm going to put a little bit of green Loctite in the case, and I'm going to see if I can get this bearing out as well. So there's both bearings out of this piece. I'm going to put a little bit of green Loctite in, and I mean a little bit. Does not take much. Okay, I'll push the bearings back in. Make sure you get the orientation of this correct. Now I can go ahead and get these 2 screws in here that will hold the bearing in at the bottom here. Okay, don't forget the little washer. Okay, now we're going to make sure everything still rotates super freely. Perfecto. Okay. Now that we have this subassembly with our 2 little bolts tightened at the bottom, we can go ahead and add our motor mount as the next step. All right, we got that aligned, and then let's get some Loctite on these guys. There's also this top plate here. The motor mount plate helps capture that top bearing as well and hold it in position. And now you've probably noticed how good a job GOOSKY does on machining parts. The machine fit and finish on this stuff is fantastic. All right, don't go crazy tightening these. There's not a ton of metal they go into, but just make sure those are good. Okay. That's good to go. Next thing we're going to do now is go ahead and bolt our motor in. It is important to note the orientation of the wires. The wires of our motor are going to come out on this side here, so these tabs will stick out the other way. So grab our motor, still in the bag, but we'll move it up here a little bit so you can see a little better. And then we're going to go ahead and put this direction. So wires going away from these tabs here. And looks like we have to loosen the set screws to get it to slide down the shaft. I'm going to go ahead and take the set screws all the way out. Yeah, it looks like just 2. Okay, now the motor should slide in. Nice tight fit, which is good. Now it's important, especially with eco-drift motors, but really any motor for that matter, that you have the right fit and that the bolt you use does not go so low into the can of the motor that it impedes rotating parts. So always check that. Usually the bolts in most kits are correct, but every now and then you get a bolt that's a little bit long, and then you'll have to supplement with something shorter out of your own inventory. Don't put a ton of Loctite on these bolts. I mean, they definitely need to be Loctited, but if you go crazy with the Loctite, it is a bear to ever replace the motor or remove the motor for service. And again, you know the drill by now. Setting all 4 finger tight first, and then we'll come back and sort of crisscross star pattern tighten these. Be really careful anytime you hold a screw over a motor as well. It's really possible for them to get sucked inside the motor, and if it's in there so deep that you can't get it out easily, it's a pain to take the motor apart. Well, not a pain. It's just, you know, it's an extra step, and you're going to lose half an hour, 45 minutes of time in your build. And then once you've got all 4 in, we can start tightening. And then to check that none of these motor screws are too long, just gently start to twist the motor. Should feel pretty free and easy. Okay, that's great. Okay, next step is to tighten our set screws on the pinion. And the fun part of this is finding the flat spot on the motor shaft. So you got to kind of hold the pinion while you rotate the motor shaft, and you're looking for that flat spot. And when you got it, just hold it there. Go ahead and get the set screw on our driver. Get that nice and soaked in Loctite, and then again, you're going to take most of that Loctite off with your finger. And then double check you're still looking at the flat spot on the motor shaft. See, I felt a little resistance there. You notice how I backed the driver up? It's because it was starting to cross thread. Back it up, take your time, be patient, as my friend Brian Birdsong likes to say on a build, which is fantastic advice. And then set that first set screw, and then we're going to come to the second set screw, which is not on the flat spot. The first one should always be on the flat spot. And then we'll set our second set screw. You can be pretty firm with these. That's a hardened motor shaft, and the pinion's pretty darn stiff too, so you can give these the business. Now there is a little bit of extra Loctite you can see came out of that set screw. I don't like any of that to be in the teeth of my pinion, so I'm going to go ahead and clean that out. Okay, now with any rotating assembly, just make sure everything spins freely. Just giving it a quick listen, make sure I don't hear anything grinding in there, but everything's good. All right, with that, we're good to go. We're going to go ahead and put the motor back in the bag before we put it down and keep it pristine. Add this to the wall of eco-drift motors over here. I think there's at least 8 or 10 in there. And come back to the bench. All right, we're running out of stuff that goes between side frames. Surely the next step is to consider some side frames. Let's take a look. Okay, looks like we're going to do some prep. We're going to start getting things like Canopy quick releases in, some little reinforcement mounts, some Canopy front supports, bolt a little of that into each of the upper side frames, and then we're going to prep some battery rails and battery retaining latches into the lower side frames on each side, and then we start to get to do fun stuff and start bolting these frames together. So let's go back to that first side frame step here and dig into it. So first thing, Canopy attachment dealio cup quick release thing. Every now and then I change out my Loctite baggie, by the way. I don't like Loctite sitting exposed to the air for too long. Okay, starting with our left side frame, we take our little screw with the angled sides, take that through our recessed hole from the inside towards the outside of our left side frame, and then take our Canopy quick release cup and just kind of hold that as you tighten the screw, and then that's good to go. Make sure you're orienting these things the same way as the manual. It helps you find the orientation of the parts. And then we're going to put just a single bolt through this rear fuselage reinforcement mount, for now anyway. So that'll go through the very back corner hole. Okay, and then the only other thing to do is the front canopy piece here, which is just the guide that keeps the canopy centered on the frame. And then that goes through this little ridge right here, with this piece going on the same side as the canopy cup. Same thing, just hold that in your fingers and tighten it up. Doesn't have to be crazy tight. Okay, so we've got our front canopy pin, our rear canopy quick release attachment point, and just one bolt through our fuselage reinforcement mount. That's it for this side frame. We'll grab the other upper side frame, and I've already gone ahead and put the other canopy cup piece in. That's oriented the same way as the manual, just helps us know what's going on. And then we'll take our rear fuselage reinforcement mount, that's a mouthful. Get that piece in. And then there are also this other unique plate here. Looks like a tail servo mount. Yep, that's exactly what it is. And that's going to bolt in now at this point as well. And that goes through the top of this rear fuselage bracket and then bolts into here. And again, this is one of those deals, orient it just like the manual and it'll help you figure out which way this goes, like so. I'll show you in just a second. I just got to get the screw started so I can get it. Okay, so you can see here is our rear side bracket, and then the tail servo sort of extends beyond the tail servo bracket, beyond the edge of the frame a little bit. Make sure you get both screws in there with Loctite and then tighten them down. Okay, and then last but not least, the other front canopy mount in the same spot as the other side frame. I like these steps because you have something to look forward to. You know that as you finish these, you can start slapping the side frames together, and it's going to start looking like a helicopter. Okay, that is our upper side frames prepped. Moving on to the lower side frame prep. Lower side frames are really easy to tell which side is which because it's only got printed graphics on obviously the left and right sides. So the inside is not printed. So that's the side your battery rails will bolt against. So starting with the left side frame, this guy here, because it's got graphics, this guy here, sorry. So it's got graphics on the left side of the frame. So starting with the left side panel here, just note that in the manual, here I'll show it to you again, it doesn't show the graphics on this carbon side frame, but obviously the battery rail is not going to go against the side with the graphics. So just be aware that that is the orientation it's in. So we're going to go ahead and grab one of our battery rails. It orients with this sort of funny downward bit towards the front of the helicopter, this piece right here. And then we're going to go ahead and get our 1, 2, 3, 4 screws across here to hold this into the frame. Now, any of these battery rail pieces, get your first screw kind of started. And we're not going to tighten any of these until we get all of the bolts through, because these can be a little fiddly to line up sometimes. So there's our first bolt, and then I usually do the last one. And then the others start to line up if you go that way. Okay, now that I have all 4 screws started, I'm going to go ahead and tighten these. This is pretty soft aluminum here, so don't go crazy on this. Just snug them up. That's all you need. Okay, now that we have that in the same side frame, we're going to go ahead and take our battery piece here. Now, it's always really important in these that you take every last bolt out of these and Loctite the heck out of it, because this is what holds your battery into the helicopter. Now, be really careful when you take this first screw out of the end of the button, because it is literally will launch on a spring if you don't get the bolt back in before you let go, because there's a, the spring that obviously makes this spring in and out here. Lets it do that. So when you take this bolt out, this is going to want to go and shoot off that way. So get this tightened first. Okay. Go ahead and pop these screws out. Manual shows green Loctite here. I think blue is fine. You could use red if you wanted to. But if you crash and break a lower side frame, you're going to have to take this out. So that's why I don't go with green here. So battery latch obviously on the outside of the frame, on the printed graphics side, and then the screws come from the inside. Okay, just make sure that freely moves, and it does. You can see here, the pin comes through to the same side as the battery rail, spring piece on the outside. Okay, that is the left side frame. Oh, nope, almost missed the canopy attachment point on the front. So very helpfully, GOOSKY has put a little L, you may not be able to see here, or an R on these. So we want the left side plate here. So this will go in this little, it's got this little metal raised piece here that just tucks right in like that, which is great. And then obviously that hole lines up. You take the bolt, goes from the outside through to the inside, get my driver kind of holding it, and then it gets a backing nut, which is a lock nut. They show this screw in green, meaning it would get green Loctite, but we're not going to do that because it's into a lock nut. So we would not do that there. And we're going to need something to hold that nut from spinning. Okay, so we've got a nut driver holding the nut, and then we'll tighten the screw from the other side. And then that little metal recess piece here will hold the thing in orientation. So now that's gone and captured. All right, now for real, that's it for the left side frame. We're now going to do similar to the right. Obviously, there won't be a battery piece on the right side frame. So graphics on the right side frame facing out, and then we just need to take our screws here, whoops, and capture our battery rail. Running out of room on my bench with all these sub-assemblies everywhere. We got to get some of this mounted into a helicopter here. Same thing, we'll start with our front, go to our back, fill in our other screws. I'll catch you back up once I get this, and then I'm also going to add the canopy attachment point that we just did on the other side, and then we'll come back. Okay, that's the side frame done. Canopy attachment point, battery rail. That's it for the right-hand side frame. All right, the moment we've both been waiting for. It's time to start attaching stuff together, and don't let a step like this with 12 billion little red lines and 400 blue Loctite bottles scare you. What we're going to do is take our center frame assembly here. We're going to join our boom clamp assembly to our center hub here, and then one side frame at a time. We're going to, using these servo rails here, top and bottom, we're going to run bolts through here, through the servo frames, through the side frames, and various points to capture the boom clamps, this top plate, bottom plate, all of this. We're going to go real slow and make sure the important thing is to count the number of screws you see in the drawing, and then make sure you do a double check that you got them all. All right, so we will grab our upper right side frame first. And we're going to start working with that and then go from there. Okay, so here's our upper right hand frame. It's got the canopy cup here facing me. And I'm then going to grab our boom clamp assembly here, like so. And also our center crutch, for lack of a better word, that's here. And these two are captured by a couple of M3x8s. Now, in any of these sort of frame assembly steps, see how that's floppy? I'm not going to tighten these bolts. I'm not going to tighten any bolts until I have all the bolts in loose from both sides. And then I'm going to put the helicopter on a piece of glass. I'll show you in a second. That's going to help us make sure we get all of this really square and tightened up. So keep everything loose as we go through this. So we're going to take our sweet time here as we get things aligned. So the first thing I'm going to do is make sure I have the right servo rail. And you can tell by the angle of the bracket here. So I know that it sweeps back towards the back of the frame. So I know that that is correct there. And I'm going to start with that. I'm going to look for our 3x10 bolts. And we're going to start with 2 of those through the servo rail and into our center crutch. And we're going into not the front holes here initially. Those will be for the motor mount. I'm going to go through this piece here, right about just in front of the servo attachment point. And then we're going to line it up with the hole here on our crutch. And one of the cool things about GOOSKY frames is you'll see all these little indents or pieces that stick out of the center crutch, and they're going to sort of self-align with this frame, which is awesome. So it kind of clicks into place. Now that isn't the case with the boom clamps, but it is with this sort of positions here. So that's our first bolt sent home. I was like, something's wrong. It's because that spun on me. There we go. And then we're going to take another 3x10. And these first bolts are always the trickiest because everything's flopping around and nothing is at all even remotely rigid. So again, I'm just sort of like snugging these and letting everything kind of flop around. Okay, so there's our servo rail attachment with our 3x10s. Next, we're going to get a pair of 3x8s through the top servo rail. And 8 is referring to the length of the 3mm bolt. And those are going to go right at this part in the frame when it starts to slope here. So these 2 holes here. So we take our servo bracket, it goes right above the other one with the same angle. The good news is once you figure out one side, you can use the other side as, you can use it as a guide for the other side. So the first one takes a minute, but the second side is much faster because you know where everything's going. Okay, so what we've done so far, these 2 3x8s, these 2 3x10s through our servo rail, capturing the frame. We're going to put 4 3x6s into our boom clamps. Now there are probably some guys and even some GOOSKY team pilots who will tell me I'm crazy and that I could very easily do this and just tighten them right now because the frame kind of self-aligns. And they're right, it does self-align, but I just like things as close to dead on square and perfect as I can possibly make them. I mean, the more work you put in setting up and building a helicopter accurately, the better it flies every single time. But honestly, they'd be right. These frames really do self-align, so worry not. It's really hard to screw this up. Okay, that's our 4 through there. Now we're going to take another 3x6. And hit this top corner right here, right after the curve in the frame. Now we're going to take 2 2.5x6s. And those are going to go, remember this guy here that we sort of set the angle of? Those are going to go into the back side of that pulley on that clamp. And I think that's it for this side, but let's do a double check. Let's go back to the manual and we're going to play count the screw. So on this side, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So let's check it back on the frame. So you should have 2 on this boom clamp. That's 2. That's 4, 6, 8, 10, 11. I'm missing this guy right here. That's 12. So see, that's why we do that. We always find something. Okay, so showing you this if you want to hit pause and do a reference. So these 2 screws, these 2, this guy, 4 boom clamps, and you are good to go, plus these 2 that capture the pulley. All right, we're going to do the same thing on the other side, except we will not have these 2 around this pulley as well. So flip this way, grab your other upper frame side, lay it over the top. Again, these little pieces that stick out right here are going to sort of self-align this frame. So let's do that while it doesn't have any hardware in it. And kind of push it into those. And just like that, our frames are kind of pre-aligned. We can go ahead and start dropping screws in here. I'll run through all the screws I put in just a second, but I'm going to do that all off camera here. Okay, we got this side done. Let me take you through all the screws you need to remember. 4 boom clamp screws. These guys right here on the corners. 2 here, capturing the servo rails, and then you're good to go. All right, we have our upper side frames. Now again, everything's loose. So what I like to do, and I think I'm actually going to take this tail servo out of my way for a minute. So I'm going to actually break these bolts now and take this bracket out for just a minute. And I'm just going to do that so the frame can sit flat on my table. Okay, I'll tuck that out of the way. Now, you can order this from Amazon or wherever. This is just a glass tempered shelf. It just means the edges aren't sharp. And I can set it right on my bench, and it is guaranteed to give me a perfectly flat edge. Let me slide this a little closer for the camera. There we go. So if I push down on these frames while this is sitting on this glass pane here, it guarantees both frames are dead, parallel and even with each other. So they're the exact same height. So what I do is I just push down on the frames, and I'll go ahead and tighten all of these bolts. And you're going to do a double check, make sure you get them all, but this just makes sure that everything is parallel and square. And again, all this extra work now will give you a much better flying helicopter later. But like I said, GOOSKY is very good that they give you those little indents and very accurately cut frames. Spin it around. We're going to do the other side. And that means the whole thing kind of self-aligns. So if you don't have a shelf, you'll be all right, but it is a nice extra thing to have. Do the same thing when we add the lower side frames as well. And it, you can see it only adds, what, a minute, if that, of time to leave all this stuff loose, let everything align correctly, and then just run around and tighten everything. And give it all a double check, make sure you got everything. And the only ones I need to hit again now are just the ones that are into that pulley. Send those the rest of the way home. Okay, there we go. Upper side frames are coming together. Looks good. All right. I'm going to go ahead and add this tail servo bracket back before I forget all about it. There's a lot going on in this step. We've got the middle reinforcement plates being added. We already have our rearward ones bolted in with 1 bolt for now, but we need to add our middle ones with these long bolts that'll go through and capture it into our 3rd lower bearing block here. And then we're also adding our ESC plate and our lower mainframe plate here as well. So lots going on. We'll break this down the same way. We'll go one side at a time, starting with the left side of the frame, and then we'll work on the right side. All right, first things first, let's grab this anti-rotation guide, which is just a plastic piece here. And let's get that knocked out of the way first. So that is going to sit with these. You can see there's 2 little holes right here on this plate that these pins on the bottom of this will just slot into. Theoretically. There it goes, it's just a tight fit. Very tight fit. I'm gonna walk it back and forth. And then they give you these self-tapping screws here Be careful again not to over tighten these. That'll come through from each side. So just snug that up. Don't go crazy on that. You'll just tear up the plastic. Okay, there we go. That's the easy part done. Not that any of this is hard, but you still got to pay a little closer attention now that we get to adding our lower side frames. These are the additional frame reinforcements. And let's take our additional third bearing block here. So we're going to slot that in, line up the holes down here with the holes on the third bearing block. Okay. Kind of get that loosely in. And then here comes the juggling act. We're going to take these long bolts with our red washers here. And let's get some Loctite on the very tip of that. Okay, that's going to go through, just lining up which holes here, the side frame here, through the side frame, and then through the reinforcement piece and into the third bearing block. Again, same thing here. I'm just going to loosely snug these up. I think that screw is bit. Yeah, oh, it has. There it is. Okay, great. Okay, second one, which is good because it's going to start making this whole thing a little more rigid. The side frame through the reinforcement bracket into that third bearing block. Make sure that sort of extra bushing is pointed up. That's how you know you got it oriented correctly. Okay. I'm going to loosen these so they're not quite so tight. Okay. Great. That's that. Now we're going to take a 3x10. Get some Loctite on it. That's going to go through this access hole. Show it to you here. Through this access hole and then into, oops, there we go. The frame through that support block into here. It's a little fussy getting this to align. There it goes. Okay. That's the 3x10. Then we're going to take a pair of 3x6s and go in here and here into our rear frame support bracket, that metal bracket we put in a previous step. Again, leaving these loose. We'll put this back on glass, re-square it all up before we tighten anything down. Okay, that's the 2 3x6s, the 1 3x10, the 2 extra long ones. Now we're moving up to the front ESC plate and this other tray here. Okay, so we're going to take the bottom tray and we're just going to dry fit it here, okay? So we're going to slide it in between. Here we've got our brackets pointing up on this, and it's going to go sort of above. See, our battery tray has these sort of little nibs with the threaded inserts. That's where this is going to screw down into. So it's going to sit on top of those, and then our little brackets here will fit between the upper side frames. So first we're just going to kind of dry fit this, get our holes to all line up, and then we'll start figuring out what size screw goes in what here. A few different sizes of screws going on here. Let's start with 3x6s, and we're going to do that to go in from the side into the plate. So this orientation here. If you're not sure what it's a 3x6 and a 3x8, measure it. After a while, build enough helicopters, you can kind of tell by eye. Okay, so there's our ESC plate, and you can tighten these because they're not going to affect the position of the frame. Sorry, that just took a long time to tighten, so I wanted to take a look at that. So that is these two here are now tightened. Now we can look at tightening it down into our battery support rails because it attaches there, and those screws are 2.5x5s. So that's right here, screwing down through the bottom front plate into the battery rail. And then check your battery rail. Make sure you use the right size screw. You'll know because if you didn't, it could potentially be protruding into the battery rail or otherwise doing bad things. Okay, and then we'll take a second one of those. And that's going to go here. So coming through the front plate downwards into the battery rail. Now we got to grab our ESC tray. And the little writing that says GOOSKY goes towards the front of the helicopter frame. And you'll see there's 4 holes that you just line up here. And then that's held in place with 3x6s. Again, you can go ahead and tighten these because this doesn't affect the squareness of the frame. All right, now we've got, so let's just review which screws we did here. So we've got this downward facing one. We've captured the bracket with this guy and this guy. Capture the lower bracket and then this bracket and this one here for our ESC tray. These 2 here into our 3rd bearing block, which is now here with the ridge of this bushing facing up. And then we also added these screws back into that rear bracket as well. All right, let's go ahead and flip this over. And we're going to kind of do the same on the other side with the other lower side frame. So that's going to go there, and we got to get our other reinforcement bracket kind of placed as well. And let's get one of our long screws with some Loctite on it because that's going to help us get this start to hold together. I'll try and line that up with the hole. Looks like I got lucky. That kind of dropped right in. All right, loosen that back up a little bit. Let's get the other one in. So if you start with these sort of 3rd bearing block pieces, just starts to hold the whole thing together, so it's not so awful to work with. You know what I mean, not awful, but it lines it up, holds things together. Okay, now I'm going to do these back 2 3x6s. Let's get another 3x6 and do this guy right here. Again, keeping this frame with some movement in it. And then we got to get that 3x10 through the access hole right here. So that one is not captured by the lower side frame. It goes straight through. I'll show you here. And that one we can tighten. It's not affecting the squareness of this lower frame we're adding. All right, and with that, we're now moving on to our ESC 3x6s. Our pile of screws on our mat is getting smaller and smaller. That's a good sign. You can go ahead and tighten these 2. Now we got to take care of our forward tray, not the ESC tray. We already did that. So we got to do the downward facing screws. Those are here. That's our other 4 forward plate screws. So the 2 that go down into the battery rail, the 2 3x6s that go this way. Let's get this thing back on glass and square it up. Okay, so now we set our 4 basically feet of the lower side frames on glass, and then we just run around and tighten our bolts up. As we push a little bit of downward pressure on the frame, also gives us a chance to kind of double check alignment on everything. The other thing we can do before we tighten the screws that go into our 3rd bearing block is just drop the main shaft through and then make sure that that is aligning with our 3rd bearing block okay. And if it's not, while everything's loose, it gives us a chance to kind of align things correctly. So right now it didn't drop immediately into that lower bearing block, so I'm going to make sure the lower is really truly free. Looks like it is. I'll even loosen the servo rail bolts, which will give the whole upper bearing and shaft assembly it's a little wiggle room to move as well. It's okay to go back and loosen things, and then what we want to do is have this thing drop right into that position. And it should freely move in and out. Right now it's a little stiff, but we're going to keep playing with it until it pops out pretty easily. Now bushing is a little tight, which it's meant to be. There we go. Things are starting to move a little better in and out now. I'm going to go as far now as to loosen the top as well, because I'm just not happy with how this is lining up. It's pretty close. I'm just really picky. So I'm going to keep playing with this until this main shaft kind of just drops in. And any of these bolts that are impacting how this aligns can get loosened as well. Some helicopters it'll drop through in its own weight, but this one is just a bit of a tighter fit at the bottom, which is not bad because it's in that third bearing block, but it is aligned correctly now. I'm going to go ahead and re-snug all these bolts. Also, don't forget these 2 bolts on top here that join these 2 assemblies together. We're going to tighten those as well in a second. And it's not a bad idea to take your driver and check all of these bolts that we've been messing with as we've been tightening and loosening things. And just make sure that everything has been tightened correctly. Okay, I'm going to get these 2 bolts that join the tail boom clamp assembly to the center crutch. Those are tight now. We're going to turn the frame around and do the same thing on the other side. And then we're going to double check the shaft as well. Sometimes guys like to tighten across the frame. This frame self-aligns so well, I'm not really worried about it. I'll double check the main shaft again in a second. All right, with that, you can see this thing sits perfectly, all 4 feet sitting on glass. There's no gaps underneath. It is dead square. We'll double check our main shaft is popping in and out okay. Yeah, perfect. It's dropping right in for me. Just a little bit of pressure, no big deal. Spins freely, and we're in great shape. I think that is a great stopping point for me tonight. The video is going to continue in just a second for you, and it is starting to look like a helicopter. All right, next up, servo mounting. We're going to go ahead and get our servo horns installed, as well as install the balls into our servo arm. Aim for as close to 18 millimeters from the center of the spline to the center of the servo ball as possible. Pretty straightforward there. And then we're going to go ahead and mount our servos into the frame. Make sure you pay attention to orientation, so the servo horns will point inwards on the front cyclic servos. It'll point towards the nose of the helicopter on your elevator servo, and then the tail servo is going to point up. And they've included these nice servo centering sort of washers here, which are a little bit nicer than the standard servo spacer, sort of carbon washer type deal. It helps center the servo. Why this is most helpful is if in the event of a crash and you have to replace the servo, it puts the new servo or the repaired old servo back exactly where it was before. So it solidifies the positioning of the servo. All right, with that, let's go over to the bench and start installing our servos. Now I've gone ahead and powered up my servos and centered my servo horns already, so these are all good to go. I'm going to take my tail servo here and just stick it aside and work with our 3 cyclic servos. So first things first, I'm going to go ahead and get the balls mounted on our servos. Pretty straightforward. I'll show you one and then I'll do the rest on my own. So don't put Loctite on the screw first. The reason we don't do that is that we don't want Loctite in the plastic of the servo horn because it just makes that servo horn just a little bit more brittle, and we don't want to go ahead and do that. Now I'm going to use the middle horn of these are SAB servo horns. There are servo horns included in the kit as well. I just tend to use this particular brand of servo horns in all my helicopters because I know they break really easily in the event of a crash. I'm sure these GOOSKY horns do as well. I just don't know them, and I'm going to stick with you know, the preferences that I have. So go ahead and get the screw in, and then what I do is I just take the whole thing, dip it in Loctite, take the servo ball, kind of hand thread it on, there it goes, and then you'll take a 1.5 millimeter driver into the screw just to hold it from spinning, and then a 2 millimeter driver into the ball, and just snug those up against each other. Don't over tighten that because you'll just break the servo horn, but just make sure it's nice and tight. And then keep the orientation of the servo horn so you remember which one of these is which servo. I'm going to go ahead and do the other 3 servos right now. All right, I'm going to go ahead and start with the tail servo first. And the reason I'm going to do that is simply because it looks exactly like the cyclic servos, and I want to make sure I don't screw it up and actually put the cyclic somewhere it shouldn't be. Make sure you have this servo horn orientation correct. The spline is going to go towards the nose of the helicopter with the servo horn pointing straight up, and that's just going to sit on top of the bracket. And I'm going to try and do this so you can see it too. We're going to take these servo alignment pieces and just place them in each of the servo cutouts for the screws. Just get those kind of resting there. And then we'll take our screw, get some Loctite on it, and we'll drive all 4 of these home. Of course, you're going to get all 4 started, and you're going to get all 4 of them started before you tighten them all down carefully. So just get the threads to bite. Especially with these servo centering pieces in here, you want to make sure you have all 4 screws in, because it will get the servo locked into that center position once you have all 4 screws in, and then send it home. Anytime you use these servo types of attachment points, some servos are going to fit better than others. This Theta tail servo was a bit of a tight fit, so I had to get all the servo savers kind of above the servo first, get all 4 screws started, and then, although it's very tight, I was able to get all 4 screws to drive and these servo centering pieces to fall into their channels, but this servo is locked in there absolutely. All right, now we're going to go ahead and move to our front cyclic servos. I think we'll switch to this camera for this guy so you can see this a little bit better. All right, I'm going to start with the 3rd cyclic servo, which will go with the servo horn facing in towards the center of the helicopter. And I'm just going to get it started. Leave myself lots of wiggle room in the servo itself until I have all 4 screws lined up. Because as we noticed on the tail, it's a very tight fit with these Theta servos, with these servo centering washers. There we go. That is our front cyclic servo installed there. Very tight fit here in this position as well with the Theta cyclic servos. These are the Kenny Co edition of Thetas. Your servo may vary, could be easier, worse. Worst case scenario, you can always use some carbon servo saver, the traditional method of mounting your servos. I did not see any in the kit. They might be in one of the spares bag. If not, they're easy to find in the spare parts of a variety of other helicopters. But like I said, I am able to get these Thetas to fit without too much trouble. All right, next servo is the next cyclic, and again, this arm will face inwards towards the center of the frame. We'll go ahead and get this one mounted, and then I'll show it to you. All right, that is now both front cyclic servos in. Keep in mind, the other thing you can do if these are a little tight is loosen these 2 screws holding in the top servo attachment point. That'll give you a little bit more flexibility, and then go ahead and tighten those once the servo's in will also help. All right, now we're going to work on the last servo, the rear cyclic servo. And this one is a little bit different than the other. Servo spline still goes up, but it's going to mount in the right side of the frame. And it looks like I've got my servo horn around the wrong way. I'm going to go ahead and fix that right now. All right, so this is going to go, the elevator servo on the, let me show it to you this way. Your cyclic servo is going to go with the servo horn linked, like looped in and pointing towards the front of the helicopter with the spline up. And it's going to mount to these 2 rails here and here that are exposed on this side. Like so. And then our servo alignment pieces will go on the back here. All right, there we go. We've got the rear servo mounted. Now this one was definitely tighter than the rest. I just had to go slow, keep doing my best to get everything centered. I will say the Thetas may be a really tight fit in this frame set. You might want to look at some Torx, Torque HLXs, 2208s, MKSs, KST, all the lots of great brands out there, but the Thetas I can say are a little tight. That was pretty fussy. Okay, we now have our cyclic servos, all 3 of them installed. You can see when you look at the top view how that the arrangement of the servo horns around the main shaft works out. And then we've got our tail servo mounted as well. And then now we can put the skids on, and then we're going to put this frame aside and start working on the tail. So let's stick this aside for right now and get our skid pieces out. And we'll go ahead and start getting this roughed in. I love that they've already mounted the ends and the skid pipes. I don't know, it's just one of those jobs I can't stand to do. So we'll go ahead and, oh, these are a beautiful fit as well. I've had some helicopters recently, not from GOOSKY, where it's been a really tight fit. I've actually had to drill out the skids for the skid pipes because they didn't quite fit. So it's nice to see that this is a nice, appropriate fit. It's not loose, but it's not tight either. It's not that hard to get things in place in here. So we're going to go ahead and get this level on my build mat here. Got to keep the skids parallel to get the skid pipes in. There we go. And in the manual, they show putting in the 4 set screws while it's just loose like this. I'm going to go ahead and put the lock nuts in and then get it in the frame before I tighten these, because I like to see how the whole thing sits before I decide front and back what I'm going to do with these skids. But what I am going to do right now while it's out is get these lock nuts, and they tell you in the manual you can kind of glue these in if you want to. I'm not going to bother. I'm hoping, based on how indestructible I hear these skids are, like you can bend the heck out of these. I'm not going to worry about it. It's also a pretty tight friction fit to get the nuts in here. So you see I'm just kind of pushing them on the backside, making sure to get them with the plastic side towards the outside of the frame, which means the rounded side goes towards the center. So the frame goes on the outside of each. And then no Loctite here since these are going into lock nuts, but we'll take our red spacer and our bolt. Turn this so you can see, and we're going to use our 3mm driver here, get these kind of aligned. Just put a thumb on the back side of that nut until it starts to bite, and I'm going to leave these loose until I have this thing sitting on a flat surface. Right now it's kind of propped up on my build mat here. We don't want to tighten this until it's dead flat. I like that they went with white skids and white skid pipes. I'm a big fan. Makes things really visible in the air, at least for me. Black skids disappear for me. Okay, now we're going to put it on a level surface, like so, and then we'll go ahead and tighten all 4 of these the rest of the way. As usual, you don't have to go crazy tightening these. I do like to have the skid pipes in, even though they're not tightened, while I do this, because it just helps make sure everything stays in alignment. All right, so now we've got our skids in. We just need to decide how we're going to center this. So what I'm going to do is center the GOOSKY RS7 text in here. So the space here is equal to the space here. And then I'll get these 4 set screws started, and then we'll drive them home once I have it perfectly aligned. Now I'm going to make sure I get this all the way on the build mat as well. I like to take my skids and have a little bit of toe in, which means you take the front and kind of rotate it inwards a little bit. I just like the look of that. So I'm going to set that. A little bit of toe in, center the text. And then take my set screws and tighten these down. Don't ask me why these little set screws into the skids, one of my least favorite steps of every build. All right, so check your toe in, check your logos are centered where you want them. And you can check it's biting by just grabbing the skid pipe, tug it forwards and backwards. If it doesn't move either way, then these are tight enough. Very important to have this amount that sticks out match this amount that sticks out. So don't be afraid to get out your calipers. And with that matching, I just want to get the toe in the same on both of these, but first I'm going to get a set screw started. And then I'm just going to check it from the front. Make sure the toe in looks the same. It does to me before I send the last one home. And if you're lucky, you don't drop one of these set screws. This is one of those things I think every kit should include extra of. Okay, there you go. We are on skids. Now we're going to be moving to working on the tail, so I'm going to take that, stick it way up there out of the way, and let's move on to the tail. All right, let's take a look at the tail here in depth before we start building it. So, and this diagram, because it's got everything in a line, I'm going to explain a little bit slowly so it makes sense. Okay, so we've got our 2 blade grips. We're going to have to put a servo ball with a screw through on each of them. No big deal there. Okay, we have the main head block of the tail is actually permanently attached to the tail shaft, so this is one assembly here, so that's great. So in the head block, we're going to take 2 O-rings and push them into the head block with a little bit of grease, and then this washer will go on the outside. So this line right here, everything to the right, just these 3 pieces, is what will go in the tail head block on both sides. So this side and obviously on the other side as well. Now, everything starting with this radial bearing this direction is what's going in the blade grip. And what comes in the blade grip from the factory is this bearing, this spacer, and this bearing. Those are already in this blade grip. So we don't have to worry about this guy, and this guy right here. So our 2 radial bearings and this washer are already in the tail grip. We don't need to remove those, they're good to go. So what we are going to focus on is this washer, our thrust bearing stack, and there's a little note down here that says, just like always, the larger inside diameter thrust bearing piece will go towards the center of the head, towards the head block, and the smaller one will go further away from the head block. So we'll get our thrust bearing followed by our washer and our screw, which we're of course going to wash with alcohol because that's our main spindle bolt there. So we'll make sure that that's good to go, and then we'll come back and then we'll make sure that our tail pitch slider has been assembled correctly and get that put together. All right, let's come over to the bench and take care of this. So as always, I've got everything laid out here on the bench. So this is our tail shaft, our 2 O-rings, and our brass spacer that will go on our feathering spindle. So this piece right here, what you see in the center, is what goes on to this assembly. In the blade grips, like I said, here's the 1 radial bearing here. The other one you probably can't see through here, but it's there. And the spacer is in between them. You can kind of see the difference in coloration when you look down the barrel of the blade grip. So we're going to start with this thin washer, our larger inside diameter thrust bearing, the cup part, and then the smaller inside diameter, followed by our washer and our spindle bolt here, and this is the ball that will go in our blade grip. So first things first, we're going to grab our rag, spray some alcohol on it, and then clean these spindle bolts. That way the alcohol can evaporate while we're working on other parts of this. And like I said, I don't clean many bolts in helicopters. I use Loctite 243 and it's fine. It's oil resistant, but I do always clean spindle bolts for sure. Just to be sure, because you don't want a blade grip and going shooting off your helicopter. That'll be catastrophic. All right, first things first, I always like to do the servo balls on the blade grips. So we'll take care of that. That's just like we did on our servo horns, essentially. Only we're not going through plastic, so we can get Loctite on the screw right away. And you'll tighten this with 2 drivers as well. Your 2mm and 1.5mm working against each other. Okay, there's 1. And I always like when I work on the tail to work in this fashion with everything laid out in order. So I take my time, I stare at the manual, I make sure I understand the order, make sure I understand what's already in the blade grip and what I need to get out of the blade grip. Sometimes these are like there's a Loctite retainer or retaining compound on the bearings that they leave inside the blade grip. So I always take thrust bearings out, but if radials are in there, I just leave them there. There's nowhere for them to go. They're not going to fall out of the blade grip, so I just leave them. And they don't need to be lubricated, so there's no need to work on getting them out. If you're really nervous and you want to make sure they're all in there, but like I said, when you look down the blade grip, you can see that there's 2 stacked radials and then a different color spacer of some kind in between. So I know all the pieces are in there. Okay, now I've got that started. I always do the center assembly next. And the nice thing is the order you do this doesn't really matter. Obviously within reason it does. But if you do things consistently every time, every helicopter, every tail, every head, then you sort of have a checks and balances in there where you know that things are going to be all right. So I will take a little bit of grease on my finger and get some inside the head block. And my fingers aren't really small enough, so I'm probably going to use a driver to help kind of just spread some around in there. Do the same thing on the other side. That's way too much. And just spread some around in there. Just want those O-rings to go in easily with a little bit of grease. And then I'll wipe the excess grease off my driver. And then I'll make sure there's no grease sort of through the center of the hole in here where my spindle is going to go through, because I don't want grease in the ends or the end threads of my spindle. Carefully slide that through and hold on to it, and then I'll put 2 of my O-rings on each side at a time. And then I'm going to leave a little space between them like that, and I'm going to get some grease on my finger and just kind of make sure these are well coated. and then I will push them into, as best I can, the head block. And don't be alarmed if these are a little tricky to get in. Eventually, when you tighten everything down on the tail, they'll work in. You can also take the washer and use that kind of to help you push these in. Kind of even use a flat side of a driver against it to push against the washer. Don't push against the O-ring directly with a driver, but you can push against the washer to help get these O-rings seated correctly in the head block. Okay, that's that side. We're going to repeat the process on this side. Slide R2 on, and then give them a nice coating of grease. My personal belief is always to put too much grease on. I can always wipe it away with the towel. And then push against, you can even push it all the way down against the bench here. Take my driver, push down on this washer to help compress those into the grip a little bit. And I'm not going to worry too much about them because I know when I tighten my grips, it'll all get sandwiched together. I'm just going to make sure there's no grease inside these threads. If there is, I'm going to clean it with alcohol and a Q-tip. All right, so now we have our head block here. It's not quite evenly spaced, which is not a big deal because that'll work itself out. There we go. So that's now good to go. We can move to getting, our bearings into the blade grip. We're going to go outside in as usual on that, so I'll start stacking them. I always leave out the washer that goes with the screw. I'll put that in with the screw. So I'll start with the small inside diameter thrust bearing, get a little bit of grease on that. I'm going to take the cup bearing, and I always face cup in, so the open face of the cup bearing is going to go in towards the center of the head block. Get that well covered in grease. Make sure that the cup is well filled. Pop that on there. And then the larger inside diameter, and again the way you can find that one is to just put them on the feathering spindle and rock them back and forth. And then lastly, just our little spacer washer. Okay, kind of get that all spaced evenly as best you can with your fingers. And then we're going to slot this whole stack into our blade grip as evenly as we can to get it started, especially with this really thin washer, because we don't want to bend that, so we got to try and get things perfectly, there we go, inserted, and then just compress that down. So that blade grip's good to go. I'm just going to leave that there. We're going to do the same thing on the other side. So small inside diameter, cup bearing filled with grease. I don't even know this, but most of the silicone grease we use on thrust bearings is actually food grade. So you can use this to lubricate mixers and things in factories where they make food. Okay, now we'll get this stack of thrust bearings and washers, etc. into this blade grip. That little, like I said, that little thin washer at the front, you got to make sure, don't force that because it'll just bend and then you're going to have to wait for another one to arrive. It's pretty delicate. It's not delicate once it's in and flat and level, but getting it started is a little fussy. There we go. Okay. Okay, I'm going to take a moment here to really make sure my fingers are clean. Sometimes I even spray a little alcohol on them and then towel them off. Really want to get all that grease off my hands for the drivers when I put this together. Okay. We're done with grease now. That can go away. All right, so now we just have to put the blade grips on. So we want the nice writing that says RS7 facing up. So I'm going to slide that guy on, and then I will take my cleaned bolt, get a whole ton of Loctite on it, and then work it into the threads, and then get all that extra Loctite out of there. Got a little Loctite on the head of the bolt, so I'm just wiping that off. Then I'll add the washer, and then I will align it with the end of the feathering spindle and gently start to tighten it. I won't be able to tighten this all the way because it's just going to start spinning the feathering spindle when I get close, just like that. Now I'll take my other blade grip, keep the RS7 lettering out. Notice that the balls are on opposite sides from each other. And we'll get that started. And then get some Loctite on our other feathering spindle bolt. Same thing, tons of Loctite. Work it into all the threads, the whole length, and then smear it away as you rotate. Washer. If you put a big glob of Loctite on there and just get this in there, you're bound to have Loctite get into the bearings, and that is going to make them perform in a less than ideal manner. It'll gum them up, in other words. And then your tail might have a slow wag or some other mechanical issue, and you'll be fighting that. So we're now taking two 2.5 millimeter drivers working against each other. And I'm not going to go crazy tightening that, but I'm just going to make sure they're snug and tight against each other. And then we're going to check movement. Again, this should be smooth and easy moving, but it shouldn't fall under its own weight. And then when we pull against each other, we shouldn't be able to get them to go out or in against each other. They should be nice and tight, and they really are. This is great. Perfect. Tail feels great, and when you pull them apart, they get even easier to rotate as well, which is how they'll behave in flight, but they feel pretty smooth already. This is great. All right, take a minute, clean off all the extra grease that was on your fingers that got all over the blade grips. We can move on to the rest of the tail, which is going to involve taking a look at the pitch slider. Let's just look at the manual here and see how this goes together. Now, sometimes they put these whole things together at the factory, and our tail pitch slider here, this is the most important thing, that there's Loctite on these threads that goes and screws into the last piece of our tail pitch slider assembly. So we need to make sure that these threads made it here have Loctite on them. So we're going to take an adjustable wrench here. Okay, so we're going to take an adjustable wrench here, put it on the end. Now these are typically reverse threaded. It doesn't say anything in the manual, which means to loosen it, you'd go the opposite way, and this is reverse threaded. They're reverse threaded so that they tighten naturally, and there is definitely no Loctite on here. So this is why we always check these. So you can see I'm actually turning clockwise and it's loosening because it's reverse threaded. Now this is one of those deals where we don't want to get Loctite in the wrong places. And this is also an assembly that if it goes bad, you're going to replace the whole thing. So they actually recommend green Loctite. I'm going to use red. Same difference. We just want something that is never, ever going to let go. All right, I'm going to take my awl, dip it in the red Loctite, and I'm going to put a bunch of the red Loctite around the first few rows of threads on the pitch slider. And I'm just going to kind of rotate this around, make sure I've got some in there. When you screw this on, it'll kind of spread all this out for you, but I've got some in all the threads all the way around. So now, remembering that this is a reverse thread, so you're going to turn it counterclockwise to get it to tighten onto the end here. And there we go, it's all engaging that red Loctite. As we spin it down. And then we're going to take our adjustable wrench, and we're going to turn this counterclockwise to tighten while we hold onto the front half of the tail pitch slider. And you don't have to go crazy, just snug it with some force, not an outrageous amount, and there, we're good to go. Okay, so next thing we need to do is check what I like to call the dog bones, which are these guys here. They should move this freely. So I love when they fall under their own weight. Now these are lock nuts here, so we don't need to take these apart and Loctite them. I am going to check the tightness. I don't know that the factory tightened these all the way. I got to get the right size nut driver right there, and a 1.5 millimeter driver, and I'm just going to check the tightness of these bolts. And I want them to be tight, but I still want this dog bone to flop. There we go. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Tighten them while they're still floppy. There we go. Still got good flop, still super loose, but I know they're tight. I just never trust anyone. I always want to verify that things are tight, but really from the factory those looked pretty great. All right, that's moving freely. So we've got our tail pitch slider down. Let's move on to the next step. We're going to start working on our bell crank assembly. So this guy's pretty straightforward. Comes from the factory with the bearings already installed. It has 2 bearings in it here, and then we're going to install this ball as well as the tail arm pivot screw. And then we're going to move on to the tail case. We'll install our 2 flange bearings in the tail case, as well as get our bell crank base installed with a couple of 2.5x8s here. All right, looks like the bearings have already been installed by the factory. So now we just got to get our bolts in there and get some Loctite on them. So we'll get this on our driver here, and then I'm going to use the old awl trick because I want the Loctite on the threads, not on this piece here, the extension. It's a little hard for you to see, I know. But you don't want Loctite obviously on the smooth part of that shaft. Just want some in the threads so that as we tighten, it'll spread out and engage. Okay, that's good to go. So orient the piece here just like you see it in the manual, and then we'll screw this guy in like so, and we'll wipe the extra Loctite off. All right, so there we go. Here you see our pin sticking up smooth, Loctite free, and then we're now going to get the servo ball. That'll go in. If the piece is oriented like this, we're going to flip this over and the ball will go in this direction. And we'll get some Loctite on there. And this is where our tail push rod will connect to. Get the extra Loctite cleaned up. And now we have our tail bell crank good to go. Okay, I'm going to grab our tail case and our 2 flanged bearings. And these will just be a press fit because they won't be able to move once we have our tail pulley in there, so pretty straightforward. All right, that is our tail case. Now we just got to take our bell crank base and our 2 screws, get some Loctite on those, and we'll get that installed in the tail case. So let's orient the tail case like it is in the manual. Orient the piece here. So our bell crank base, the hinge point is a little bit lower than the slot. You can see there's a little recess here where this will insert. So push that into the recess. Just a little fussy, but that helps lock it so it can't rotate. And then we're going to use the hole in the other side for our driver to pass through so that we can go ahead and tighten it down. And there's 2 screws, so I'm just going to like snug the first one up so it's loose. Take the other screw, get some Loctite, and then once we have them both in the piece, we'll go ahead and tighten them down. All right, moving on back to the manual. All right, single most important step here is to make sure you put the tail belt on. Like if I told you how many tail cases I've built where I realized I didn't put the belt on first, you would be embarrassed for me. All right, so we're going to take our rotor head on our tail shaft. We're going to add the pitch slider onto it first. There's an O-ring that's going to work its way onto the tail shaft before we slide it into the tail case through the tail pulley, oriented correctly with the set screw on the far side, it looks like. As you can see, that set screw is going to line up with the flat spot on the tail shaft. And then once we have that in, we're going to go ahead and add the screw through all of these pulleys here that just helps hold the belt on to the top of the tail pulley. So we're going to build our whole tail case here. Quick tip here, this is, and let's pick this up from Nick Maxwell, this is my tail belt in the bag. So yesterday, last night, before I wrapped up for the day, I sprayed a bunch of silicone spray lubricant on. So I use the Blaster brand industrial strength silicone lubricant, comes in a spray can here. And what it does is it's not so much because I want to lubricate the belt. What I want to do is keep it from drying out. So a dry tail belt can create more static, which can create problems for some FBLs. It also can just wear faster. So if you keep your tail belt, for lack of a better word, supple, kind of lubricated with the silicone spray, you can actually do this in the model. It's just really messy. It's really easy to just spray it in the bag, and then you're good to go and don't have to worry about it. So this might drip a little when I take it out, so I'm going to take it out of the bag carefully, kind of let the excess drip, and just lay it on my towel. And you can see there's some of the lubricant in the bag. And we're just going to throw that away. But we got a nice lubricated tail belt, which will stay nice and moistened in that state and won't dry out. All right, so first thing we're going to do is take our tail shaft assembly and we're going to put our pitch slider on it. So we're going to orient our RS7 labels so they're both towards the top so we can read the text. And then take our pitch slider, slide it onto the shaft. Now, there's usually, you can tell pretty easily here which is the outside. So this hole right here is smaller on the outside. So I know this is the outside. If I flip it to this side, you can see there's kind of an extra concentric ring here. That's the side that goes against the ball. So I know that this is going to go this direction, and this is going to slide up against this ball, and this guy here is going to slide up against this ball here. Now, I'm going to grab my ball link pliers and we're going to snap these on. So again, make sure the smaller hole on these sort of dog bone ball links here is on the outside. You want the larger hole to go against the link ball here on the blade grip. There's one, and there's two. Now, the thing with tails is every time you add another piece, check it for smoothness, right? So what I'm going to do now is just make sure this moves nice and smooth, and it does. There's not a lot of resistance. It's moving freely. The pitch slider moves freely on the shaft. The grips are rotating freely. So every time we add another source of friction, we just check things because it's a good way to identify problems, and it's a lot easier to fix problems while it's outside of the helicopter here than when it's in the helicopter. So we're good to go. Next, we're going to take our tail pulley with the set screw on this side, and I'm actually going to take the set screw out. I think there's two in this tail pulley. There is. So we'll take both of them out because we want to be able to see through here to find the flat spots. It's also a good idea to clean these with alcohol as well. Okay, so now we don't forget the tail belt, most important thing. So we take the tail belt, we put it through the tail case, and you can see this isn't really dripping, but you can kind of see the lubricant on it, keeping it from drying out. Have you ever had a really dry, brittle belt? And then we're going to fit this tail pulley between these two bearings. Now, I always try and check right here if there's any play side to side, and I don't feel any, because if there is any play side to side, they'll usually include shims in the parts bags that you can add a shim in here to make sure that there is no side to side play this direction, but I don't notice any now, so I doubt we'll see any when we put the tail shaft on. So we're going to take one of these O-rings as well. Take that after we've put the pitch slider on. We'll go ahead and slide that onto our tail shaft just up there out of the way. And then we can now engage the tail shaft into the tail pulley through the flange bearing there. And take your time here and get that aligned. There we go. And we can now get our set screw ready. Spray here. And this is because these are tiny little set screws. There's not a lot of biting surface. And we want them to have every chance to stick. So we'll clean these with alcohol as well. Kind of like how I feel about feathering spindle bolts. Okay, and then I'll leave one on the driver like that. Okay. Some guys like to use red Loctite here. I like to use blue. I've never had one let go so that the tail is easily serviceable. Now what I'm going to do is rotate the tail. I'm going to use my finger here, which is just a stop so the shaft doesn't push through, and I'm going to rotate until I find the flat spot on the tail shaft that is meant to receive the set screw. And I know that's probably impossible for you to see, but you'll know it when you turn it around and see it. Okay. And with holding everything, and it'll kind of self-align when you start to drive this set screw in. It'll, if you're off by a tiny bit, it'll kind of grab that center point. And then we're going to send it home. So these are soft aluminum, so you can't go too crazy tightening this down, but you want to go a decent amount of force on that first one. Okay, so that's good to go. Set up my second one. Now, before I go crazy and tighten the second one down, let's feel it for play. There is a minuscule amount. I don't think it's worth addressing. It's like minuscule. And I think we're good to go. I don't think it's actually even enough that we could get a spacer in if we wanted to. So it looks like there's a flat spot on the other side of the shaft as well. That's great. So we'll get the other set screw in on the back side of the pulley. Now we're going to take our rag and make sure we get any extra Loctite out of there that may have come out with our, this one especially, with our set screw. Don't want any of that working its way into the bearing. Yeah, and with the second set screw in, there's like no play in there. That's great. All right, and we remembered our tail belt. All right, we're in business here. Okay, last step is to work with our, second to last step, I should say, is to work with our tail bell crank as well as, actually, let's, before we do that, get this belt hold down pulley assembly in here. So the way this works, we're going to flip it around. So we've got these two little nubs that stick out the sides of our tail assembly here. You can see it there under my finger. And then this is going to go from the opposite side first, so the way this works is take your screw, dry, don't put any Loctite on it. You're going to have to seat the belt down. Take a spacer, slide that on. And then you're going to take a bearing, push the screw into that. Now don't push it too far because the bearings are a tight fit. So now we've got 2 bearings. Now this is where it gets a little fussy. We're going to try and get the spacer in here. Sorry, I know you probably can't see it all because my fat fingers are in the way. Now you can see I've gotten the spacer, the 2 bearings right on top of the tail pulley. In fact, they only fit in between the outside edges of the tail pulley and then the other spacer. And then I'm going to push it till it meets the thread and just barely start it. And then we're going to get a bunch of Loctite in with our awl into the receiving threads because I didn't want any Loctite anywhere near those bearings. So I'm just working it into the thread on the receiving side. Okay. And then we'll go ahead and tighten this guy up, which is capturing. You can actually see it's pushing the Loctite back out, so we know it's capturing it. And then we'll just snug this bolt up. We don't need to go crazy tightening this because in fact we want it to spin, so just kind of snug it, clean the extra Loctite, and there we go. We now have our bearings holding the belt down. So if you get to a point, and with the new belt tensioner on the R7 Ultra, it's very unlikely that your belt will ever jump or skip, but this is really going to push it down against. All right, so now all we need to do is, before we mount our tail fin on anyway, is just get this bell crank installed next. Okay, let's come back to the manual. Now, if you're wondering why you had these 2 brass washers left over from assembling it, you can see why now. So you're going to use the bolt, a 0.5 millimeter washer here, which is with the bolt. That's actually silver. And then the other 2 washers, the thicker ones, they're 1.5 millimeter thick, are going to go here and in here. So basically top and bottom of the bell crank base, and then the lock nut is going to go on top. All right, so let's do this slowly. So we take our bolt, we take the tiny silver washer that was in the bag with the bolt, and that goes all the way at the base of the bolt. We orient our bell crank assembly such that it goes like this underneath. So we're coming in from the back side. So same direction that this pin goes up is the side this goes in. And we're just going to let it barely poke over. And we're going to park one of our brass spacers there. And then this is where it's going to get fun. We also want to get one, and these have kind of a curved surface that goes against the bell crank base. And the second one is really going to be the tricky one because the first one's held in by gravity, the second one wants to fall out because of gravity. And it doesn't look like I'm going to be able to get it to go in. Basically trying to slide it in while kind of holding the other one in place with friction. Oh, that might work. Oh, the other one came out on me. So close. Dang, as soon as I get one in, the other one falls out. It's like they wait for each other. All right, this is going to be a fussy step. I'm half tempted to lick it and hope that the spit will give it a little friction so it'll stay in place for a minute. Aha, got it. Okay. I just kind of precariously balanced them both, kind of turned it sideways, tried to get them both in. Now I shouldn't celebrate until I get them captured by the bolt through the hole. So get this where you can see it without dropping anything. So I'm trying to get the bolt to line up. Oh, don't do that. Don't fall out. There we go. Sorry. There we go. Phew. Now I can talk. Sorry. Didn't want to let that go. All right, so let's talk through where everything is because my fingers were all in the way of that. So bolt head goes in this side here. There is a brass spacer here with the convex, or not convex, but the curved side facing towards this piece, curved side facing down towards this piece with the other brass spacer is in there, and then the bolt through the whole assembly. And then before we lose the whole thing, let's get a lock nut on that, and then we're going to go ahead and tighten that down. And again, this is a lock nut, so it's meant so we don't need to tighten the heck out of this. In fact, if we do tighten the heck out of this, this thing will have too much friction in it, and then our tail is going to, so I'm just going to snug that up, and you can see that this moves effortlessly. Now, we're going to go ahead and take a driver into this screw here and loosen it. And then we're going to put it over the pitch slider once it's loose. And this Loctite's still fresh, so that was not hard to loosen. And then we're going to tighten it back down. So I've basically, I'll show this to you in a second. The cup right here, I don't know if you can see that at all, is where it receives this pin. So when I turn this bell crank, it moves the pitch slider up and down the shaft. So that pin has to be received into this cup piece right here that has the hole in the top. And that allows the tail to be controlled by the pushrod. And again, once we get to this point, make sure that we are friction free. And our tail is now in great working order. Okay. All right, what's next is we're going to mount this thing onto the tail boom. So we're going to take the tail belt, slide it all the way through the tail boom, make sure it comes out the other side. And then we're going to sandwich the boom with a couple of metal plates, and then these bolts go through the metal plates, through the boom, and then into these holes inside the tail case with some Loctite. We'll also capture the tail fin on the other side. All right, while we unbag this, we got to take a moment to just celebrate how cool this printed boom is. Check this out. GOOSKY has done an amazing job printing. This is not a sticker on the boom. This is a print. I don't know what this finish is, but it's beautiful. You cannot feel an edge on the print. It's literally silk screened or printed in some fashion, painted. It feels really strong. It's not going to scratch. It's not going to peel up. Just a beautiful job printing these. And the boom is keyed, so when we slide this in the helicopter, we're not going to have to fuss with which way is up. It's just going to slide in and lock into the right position, which I love. All right, let's go ahead and first work our tail belt into our tail boom. So I always like to take some tape. This is just electrical tape, but any old tape will do. Masking tape, doesn't matter. Take a small cinch, take the end of the tail belt and pinch it flat like this and tape it. Because this first part is what catches on everything as you slide it through the boom. So if I tape it flat like that, it'll drop right through the boom effortlessly. You want to find the end of the tail boom with the two little holes in it, here and here. Start sliding the tail belt through there. There we go. And then pop the tail case inside the tail belt, and then there we go. And you can see that effortlessly, because of the tape here pinched together, makes the tail belt fall out of the boom. If you do without that tape, it forms a big fat loop, and then it catches on everything all the way down. Now, we want the lettering to be upright. Just going to look here, and I'm going to look at the frame and see where the key is for this and make sure I orient this the right way. So the key is on the top of the boom, which means this channel, what I mean by the key is the thing that aligns the boom. You can see this slot right here, that's the top of the boom. So if I orient this way with that on top, I know that that's the top of the boom. I know that the rotor head is going to come out the right-hand side of the boom. So now I know the orientation, and you can rotate it and see in the holes here that our plates and whatnot will line up with are in the right spot. And we're going to do the plate on the tail side first, so we don't have to worry about the fin while everything's also flopping all over the place until we get things tight with the first screw. And I like to get all 4 of these screws in before I tighten anything. So we'll start with the first set. There we go, that's lined up. Got our metal plate here. Let me show you. Got our metal plate. Again, I'm just getting this first screw started. Okay. Whoops, and I started with the wrong screw. So use the shorter of the screws on this side because you're not also going through the tail fin. So these are the 6mm long bolts. I accidentally put an 8 in first, so I'll pull that out once I have this metal piece in. Okay, we'll come back and tighten those in a minute. We'll grab our tail fin. Nice finish on this. I like the white edge. It actually shows up really well in the air too, that edge. And then we'll get some Loctite on these. And then Smear most of this Loctite off because I don't want it smeared all over the edge of the fin. Go through the fin, then through the metal plate, then into the boom. And then, by the way, these metal plates have a rounded edge on the inside. The rounded part obviously goes against the round boom. All right, now that we have the tail fin going the right direction, go ahead and tighten that down. There it is. Our tail boom is now good to go. We got our tail fin on, and we are all set. Okay, moving on. Okay, here's where I'm going to go a little bit out of order. The next step is just putting these tail pushrod guides onto the boom. We will go ahead and do that. The next thing we're going to do is skip ahead in the manual to page 23, and we're going to go ahead and build the tail pushrod ends because I like to finish all of the tail stuff first, and then I want this glue to start drying before I get to the point where I need the tail pushrod. So we'll go ahead and build the tail pushrod next. Now you'll see it says CA glue here. I always prefer to use epoxy. It's just a personal preference. I know that this is a compression fitting on here as well. I just feel better with epoxy doing most of the work. The compression is just an extra bonus. So I'm going to go ahead and put this together next, and then we'll add the tail pushrod guides right after that. All right, tail pushrods. This is kind of tail pushrod 101. I'm going to show you how to do this with any tail pushrod using epoxy. So first things first, we're going to take some red Loctite, and we're just going to take the end of these push rods and screw them into these guides that we're about to epoxy. It does. You can actually use a 1.5 millimeter driver to help snug those up, and then just wipe any excess Loctite away. Mainly for cosmetics. Okay, same thing, dip the other end in our red Loctite. Make sure that's good and covered there. Screw it into the end here. Okay, now we're going to pre-stage some things and get them ready for assembly. So we're going to remove the screw that is the compression fit and just put Loctite on it and then loosely reinstall it so that when we send it home, that Loctite will be there drying and ready. But don't tighten these down yet at all. Okay, there's one. I'm going to grab some needle files, doesn't really matter what shape. And all I want to do is rough up, and you can use any tool for this, the inside of this fitting. So I'm just going to kind of scratch it. I'm just trying to give little more friction for the epoxy to hold to. And sometimes when they're machined, they're all smooth, and I just want this. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time, but just a little bit of time here, roughing this up. And again, you could probably just put these on some CA and tighten them down and be okay, but this is just extra assurances. I don't want to lose the tail. So that's all I'm going to do, right? Just a little bit. Just getting some grooves in here, scratches, messing it up. If you look down in, you can see I'm kind of scuffing it up a little bit. Okay, that's it. Okay, put those away. All right, now we're going to put these ball links aside. We're going to wait for the epoxy to dry to install those. And we're going to take a little bit of sandpaper. This is just a really rough grit, like a 60 or 80 grit, and we're just going to sand the last, say, 3/8 of an inch of the push rod. Now, sanding carbon is toxic. I should really be doing this outside or wearing a mask, but I'm not getting that much dust on here. Definitely wash your hands afterwards. And all we're doing is scuffing the last, basically the same idea that we were doing inside the push rod. We're just getting a rougher surface with some scratches in the last 3/8 of an inch of the push rod. Okay, that's done. Now we're going to go ahead and mix up our epoxy. You can use JB Weld. I use Bob Smith's 30-minute epoxy. It's never failed me yet, knock on wood. Little cup, stir stick. You can use 5-minute. It just doesn't give you any leeway if you are a little bit off. I like 30-minute. And it won't fully cure for about 24 hours, but the compression fit is going to be doing all of the work almost immediately. So equal amounts of both sides. Now if you want to go crazy, you can do that over a gram scale and measure and weigh, but I don't get that fancy. So stir our epoxy up. And then what we're going to do is smear the epoxy on the sanded end. And then we will slide our fitting over the end, tighten that compression screw, clean off the extra epoxy, and put the push rod aside to dry. real easy. So take our well-stirred epoxy and just kind of roll the push rod in it. Get some on the end as well, because why not? And then take our fitting. Kind of rotate it, move the epoxy around. Make sure there's plenty on there. Okay, while holding this down so it doesn't slide back up as you tighten, we'll tighten the compression bolt there. Okay. And using my messier rag, I'm just going to wipe the excess epoxy away. Now, if this didn't have a compression bolt on it, I would always take some masking tape and tape this, because sometimes the epoxy will actually walk the end of the push rod off as it cures, and you want to make sure it can't pull, but this compression fitting is doing all that work, so there's no way for this thing to back off. So there's one end. Take the other guy here, same thing, epoxy. Slide this piece down. I'm going to coat it one more time. This just ends up sliding a bunch of epoxy into the nose of this sleeve. Okay, hold that. Tighten the compression fitting. Try not to let the epoxy drip on you, right back into the cup. Wipe off the extra epoxy. Just going to get rid of that rag because it's gross. And there we go. There is our push rod end there and there. I'm going to set this aside to dry and forget about it for a while. Probably until tomorrow. Now, I like to do that ahead of time so it is plenty dry. You can actually take your epoxy cup, put it somewhere else on your bench. You can always check that it cured there, and if it cures in your cup and becomes rock solid, you know it's cured in your joint and become rock solid. All right, so let's go back up to where those tail push rod clamps go and just pop those on so that's ready to go. And here they are with their tiny little bolt and nut. By the way, there's 12 million plastic bags. If you want to save the bags, save them, but it's way faster to just cut the bag open, throw the pieces away. I keep all the big ones, I throw away all the little bags, and then you're not spending so much time, because all that time opening bags adds up, believe it or not. Okay, so these don't have a front or a back, doesn't really matter which way you slide them on, but we'll slide them onto the tail boom now before we forget. So over your tail belt and then over the boom. Now in the manual, they've given you the spacing between these. It's essentially 295 millimeters from the front of the boom to the first one, and then 280 millimeters between them. I don't get that specific about it. I just sort of space them out by eye once I have the tail push rod installed. But I do want to get these bolts through here. No Loctite here because these are simply captured lock nuts. There is a recess here that will capture the nut, so we'll go ahead and put the nut in and try and keep it upright. All right guys, so I'm going to save you some time here. So it turns out that the nut is a really tight press fit into here. So before you put the clamp on, take the nut, line it up, get it the right way up, and then take a driver. I'm going to use a 3 millimeter and use it as a press and just push the nut in to its recess. Because it's a tight fit. You'll never get it just holding your finger there. And then once it's in, then go ahead and slide this onto the helicopter. Boom. And tighten the bolt through it. And I'm going not very tight, just enough to capture the nut in the bolt, and then leaving it alone. There we go. So, tail push rod guides in place, but still loose enough I can move this around a little. All right, this next step is all about the tail belt tensioner, which is brand new to the RS7 Ultra. So we have our tail belt tensioner sort of hinge piece here that we need to get this whole stack of pulley and spacer. So this pulley comes with this bearing pressed into it. this spacer in the middle and this bearing pressed into it. So really it's a screw with the washer back through another washer and then into here, and then we're going to just press these two flange bearings into here as well, which is actually already done by the factory. So let's get that far first. We're going to go through this slowly because it's a little confusing, not confusing in the manual, but it just takes a minute to wrap your head around it. So we have the piece here with our two flange bearings already pressed into it. We'll put that aside. We'll take our shorter of the two bolts, so the 18mm long one, we run it through a washer. Then we go through our pulley, so there's the bearing there, there's the other bearing there, and you can see the spacer has already been set in between. So we're going through there, then we're going to go through another washer, and then these threads are going to go into this portion right here of our tail bit tensioner. So we're going to go ahead and get some, whoops, lost my washer there, Loctite in these threads here. And I'm just going to use the all method to get that Loctite in there. And then I'm just going to wipe off the extra Loctite from the top portion, okay? And then we'll take this assembly with all our washers and everything else stacked on it and just finger tighten that until we get it close. And then again, we'll tighten this, but not too much. Just want to snug it. Maybe just a tiny bit of pressure from there, and then just triple check that everything's rotating. That's actually a little tight, so I'm going to loosen that up a little bit. The Loctite will do its job. There we go. That's rotating much freer now. So take your time with these things. Make sure they rotate freely. Don't go crazy tightening things. The Loctite will do its job, and there we go. So that part's good. So here's where it gets a little funky. We've got to join the sort of frame mounted piece with the hinging part and then also get this spring in here. So let's zoom in, and again, this is one of the key pieces of a digital manual. So you can see they show you the orientation of the spring in this upper right piece here. So you can take a look at the spring and look how these two fit together. So we're going to take the tension pulley bracket base. We've got to get these brass spacers inserted in them. So there'll be one that inserts up this way, one that inserts down this way. We've got to get our spring captured in there as well, and then get the bolt to go all the way through, and then the lock nut at the bottom. So let's go ahead and do that now. So we take this piece here and our brass spacer pieces, and let's push those in. So the wide sort of flange part stays up towards the center. These are a bit of a tight fit, but they do go, so be patient. Slide the other one in. Okay, so we've slid one in this way and this way. You can see the brass part there and there. And you really got to make sure those brass pieces are all the way seated to get this to fit. It's a bit of a tight fit. In fact, I might even take some giant pliers and use it like a bearing press here. And I'm just making sure those are seated all the way because there's very little extra room. And let me see if that goes in any better now. Yep, much better. So I just had a little too much friction there. All right, now it's time to assemble these two parts together. So we're going to take this piece here and just push it between those two brass bushings here. Now this is the one part in the manual I think they could do just a little bit better, is helping you figure out how this spring works. So the way it goes is, and I'm going to show this, is that these feet sit on top of this flat spot of the bracket here. And then this piece has to go underneath. Well, this is tricky to talk and do this. So I'm going to push these two together in this orientation. Now I'm going to insert the spring from the top. So get these seated in your hand like this. So now I've got everything so it's all aligned, and I'm going to go ahead and drop the spring in. Kind of compress it a little. Like this. So the spring sits on top of everything. It's the last piece you put in. Then we put our bolt through. We got to get everything kind of aligned. Goes through there, goes through there. So when we have the spring on top of everything, when we hinge this, it'll now compress. See how the spring action works like that? So let's get the lock nut on the bottom. And again, I don't think the manual details really well where this spring goes. It's the one weak spot I found in this manual so far. So that's what this build video is for. Okay. I'm going to take this and again, just snug the tension here. Don't go crazy tightening this down. Let the lock nut do its work. So now you can see how this works. And when it's bolted into the frame, here's how we get our tension. All right, because the belt will be here. Here's where we get our spring tension. So the key is just to make sure when you hinge this all together, the spring is sort of sitting on top of this whole assembly when it's in this orientation. All right, let's move on from here. All right, this next step is all about getting our main gear and tail pulley in, inserting our tail boom, getting the belt wrapped around the tail pulley, dropping our main shaft through, and making sure the twist in our belt is the right direction so that our tail turns clockwise when our rotor head, making sure our tail turns counterclockwise when our main rotor turns clockwise. And then eventually we'll also get the main shaft collar installed as well, which they call the spindle fixing ring in the manual. So first step is I'm going to get the tail belt by sliding down the boom untwisted. So I want to make sure that this is correct, and it is. And I know if I rotate this counterclockwise, and if I turn clockwise, I now get a counterclockwise rotation. So let me show you in the overhead. So this was the correct orientation of the tail belt. So when I go this direction, it now rotates clockwise. I'm going to go counterclockwise on the rotation. If I rotate my hand in a clockwise fashion, the tail now turns counterclockwise. So this is the orientation of the belt I want. So I'm going to bring it round, keep it the orientation I want, tuck it through the first boom clamp. See if I can get it. Oh, it did go right through the second one. That's great. And then I'm going to push this piece in. See if I can grab the tail belt. I can keep some tension on it with my thumb on this hand right here. So I'm pulling the tail belt as I slide the boom in. I can grab the boom now on top. Give me a little more ability to push it. Now this rubber fitting is meant to be tight so it doesn't just immediately slide in. I have loosened these boom clamps already. There it goes. We're through the first one. Now we've got to line up that key, which is the groove in the top of the boom, into our second boom clamp and get that to grab. There we go. And then we're going to gently slide this all the way forward. So there we go. It's all the way forward now. And you can see we've got the tail boom now in, and I have the tail pulley in the correct orientation. Okay, so next thing to do is insert our main shaft and our gears. So main gear goes with the red piece facing up. Tail pulley goes. First we're going to remove the gigantic bolt, good Lord, with a 4mm driver. Take the bolt out of the tail pulley. We won't put that in until we're ready. All right, now we're going to stack, starting with our tail pulley here. See if we can get the camera to focus in the right spot here. Sorry. We're going to wrap our tail belt around the tail pulley. And then we're going to slide our main gear underneath it with the red piece facing up. I'm going to keep some tension on this tail pulley on the tail belt so that we don't lose it. And this is a bit of a tight fit, but you kind of jockey it all through. Okay, now I'm going to go to the overhead and bring this around this way so you can see. And what we're trying to do now is drop the main shaft through here, through the center of both gears. So we're trying to line up our main gear hole with our tail pulley hole with the main shaft hole. That's pretty close. And then we also now need to get our main shaft collar on top as well. We're not going to tighten that right now, but we do want to just make sure it's on the main shaft. So the order the main shaft goes through is the main shaft collar first, and make sure it's the right way up. Looks like it's symmetrical, okay? And it looks like we're going to have to just loosen the set screw in here to get it to drop through. So there's 2 set screws in here, so just make sure you back them out enough that it won't impede the main shaft going through. So main shaft through the main shaft collar. Slide that all the way up. Just tuck it out of the way for now. main shaft into the top bearing block, through the tail pulley, through the main gear, into the one-way. I got most of the way there on the first try. I'm going to turn this sideways so you can see. So now my thumb is underneath here. I'm trying to feel for when the shaft goes all the way through the one-way. It actually looks like we are through the one-way. We just need to come down just a little bit more. And what I'm looking for now is to find the hole in the main shaft. I think it's a little higher than the tail pulley right now, so just gave it a little love tap there. Might have actually gone too far with the main shaft there. Let's try and slide it back up a little. Pushing up on the main shaft. Right now, what I'm doing is looking through the hole, there it is, in the tail pulley to see the hole through the center of the main shaft, and then trying to line them up. So right now it's close. You can almost get a driver in it, but not quite. Get a skinny driver. And obviously the one-way means that you can only rotate it so much, so I need to come up just a little more. Sorry, I know you can't see this right now. It's really tricky. Sometimes you can take your awl and kind of use that to help align the holes, kind of move things in the right direction, and then work your way up to a larger driver. I'm pretty much there. I don't want to just push because it's really hard to move this a tiny amount. There we go. Now we're good. So now we're going to take that gigantic bolt and figure out which side of the tail pulley has the threads on it. So this is the side it'll insert from. Is here. So I'm just going to set that down so I can get some Loctite on this bolt if I can figure out where that went. So we'll get some Loctite on the end of the threads here. Way too much. There we go. Okay. Now we're dangerous. Okay. I'm going to rotate this back. I'm going to use a driver to just help align the tail pulley in the hole a little better. Okay, that looks pretty good. We're going to take our bolt on the end of our driver. Try and send it through the hole. Once you get it started, I know there's no threads initially, but you can kind of just twist the bolt to usually get it to drop through. And you can give this a good amount of force, get that nice and tight. These pieces are rotating at 2,000 RPM or so. And then the next thing I like to do is we're going to grab our tail boom and just put a little bit more tension on that tail belt. And moment of truth, let me get it where you can see the tail rotor as well. I'm going to rotate the head clockwise, and the tail rotor should go anti-clockwise, and then we're going to listen. Make sure we don't hear a twist in the belt, which you'd hear the teeth rubbing against each other. And we have everything correct. So we now have our main gear installed, tail pulley installed, and we've loosely set the tail belt tension. We're going to come back to that in a minute. So before we set tail belt tension, we're going to get this main shaft collar here, and that's as simple as pulling up on the head, pushing down on the main shaft collar, and tightening it. But first we got to pull the bolts out and get some Loctite on there. So you want me to start with the biggest bolt first, because I don't have links on these servos yet. The Swash keeps wanting to drop on me. So I'll get some Loctite on there, get that guy started. Then before we tighten it, we will lift up on the Swash, push down on the ring, and it really doesn't have the tolerances in here are great. There's not a lot of room for this to go. So let me rotate this a little so you can see better. So I'm going to lift, I'm pushing down on this ring, as well as lifting up on the head, and then I'm going to go ahead and tighten this pinch bolt. Then we'll come back and do the 2 set screws, but this pinch bolt does the lion's share of the work. Now you can put a good amount of force on this bolt. The set screws you need to be cautious of. It's actually pretty easy to break. And I'm not talking about this one specifically, but any of these main shaft collars can be pretty fragile. So I'm going to loosen the set screw now and get some Loctite on it. And actually, I just remembered something. Let's check this. I'm actually going to loosen the main shaft collar. Of big importance here, there is a flat spot on the main shaft where this collar set screw will make contact. So I'm actually going to line it up so you look through the hole where the set screw goes, and then find that flat spot on the main shaft. Then loosely tighten the set screw. That'll just stop it from rotating. Now I'm going to do the pinch bolt. Now I'm going to come back and tighten the set screw, and then I'm going to turn it around and get the other set screw. Again, don't over tighten these. These split rings love to crack. It's happened to me on multiple helicopters. I've learned my lesson the hard way. So we'll take the other set screw out, get some Loctite on it. And it looks like there's a flat spot on this side of the main shaft as well. And that's great that it is lining up. That's a nice touch of GOOSKY to put those flat spots in there. A lot of these main shaft collars just rely on, so now you can see the main shaft collar in place, and there was a flat spot right on the main shaft for the little set screw, this guy here, and this guy here to go into, so that's great. All right, this thing's starting to look like a helicopter. We've got our rotor head on now. Our swash plate still needs to get inserted here, so I'm actually just going to pull this piece back and get our pin through our guide here. So that's all set, and this flexes enough. You can just flex it back and pop it in there. But we've got our main shaft collar on. Our tail belt is now wrapped around our tail pulley. Our main gear's in there. All right, next step to do here, so we've done this. We've gotten our main gears in, our tail pulley, tail belt, is to put the tensioner in, and then we're going to set tail belt tension, and we'll talk about that here. So get these two bolts in with our tail belt tensioner in from the other side. We'll get those tightened. And then here, and I'll try and show you this with the camera, but there are some lines on the tensioner that will align against each other when the tail belt is fully tightened. So after you fully tighten the belt, you tighten the two screws clamping down the tail boom, and these are the screws that go in the bottom of each boom clamp that just pinch it. And we pre-Loctited those a long time ago. If you didn't do that, you can get some Loctite, or if you want to put some fresh Loctite on them now, go ahead and do so before you get going here. But for now, let's work on installing the tensioner, and then we'll be able to set tension. All right, time to mount our tail belt tensioner into the frame. So we're looking at the right side of the frame, and the way this is going to go is once we get this bolted, we're actually going to take out these two bolts that we put in earlier into our boom clamp and put those back through the tensioner. This is going to be a little fussy because it's under tension, obviously, because it's a tensioner. Sorry, I'm not trying to make a bad pun, I swear. So get that in there, get the first screw kind of ready. You sort of got to compress the spring with your hand. Get this belt kind of roughly in there. Get the second screw, kind of pull that into place. All right, now we can tighten these two bolts back into our boom clamps. And you can see this is now putting tension on our belt. Now, here's the cool part. There is a guide, and I'm going to see how I can figure out, I'm going to show you this, to how much to tension your belt. So, can you see, where is it here? Here, this white line. I'll angle this towards you. See how this line is currently at an angle? And there's also a line here, up and down. We want those lines to be even. So if I put tension, you can see this line rotates. So we want these lines to be in alignment with each other, and that says we have enough belt tension. So we're basically going to pull that into alignment, and then we're going to tighten our pinch bolt on the boom as well. In alignment, and then I'm going to tighten the rear boom clamp as we do that. And then we're going to go ahead and tighten the other forward boom clamp. So again, our lines, once we've correctly tensioned the tail belt according to GOOSKY, these two lines here will be joining. So the vertical line and the horizontal line here are now matched. There's tons of tension on the tail belt. Tensioner still has a little room to move and keep things tensioned, and we're good to go. All right, and then let's just give that a check. Make sure the tail boom's nice and tight. We've got it all tensioned correctly. Again, make sure your screws that tension the tail belt are coming in from the left-hand side of the frame in both cases. If they're going from the other side, obviously you won't tension because you're just tightening against nothing there. So, all right, with that, we're good to go. Sounds good. All right, let's move on. All right, one of the last steps of the build, we're going to install the motor in the frame. Now, we already pre-built this whole assembly, so it's just a matter of putting the motor in the frame, setting the gear mesh, and then getting all of these screws and their finishing washers installed, especially these two screws that go straight down, these N3x8s with the washers that will join the motor mount plate to our sort of center crutch to make this whole thing a very rigid frame assembly. Okay, this is our motor assembly from much earlier. I still have it in the plastic bag, and I will all the way till I put it in the frame. We've got our screws with our finishing washers here ready to go. So the first thing we're going to do is quite simply take the motor out, and we're going to just loosely fit all of these screws. So the motor assembly with the pinion will just simply insert into the frame, keeping it sideways. It's a bit of a tight fit, and then we'll slide it not quite against the main gear yet. It's going to gently rest it so we can get all of these screws started by hand. So the first screws I'm going to start with are our two with washers, which are a little tricky because they face straight down, and we need the washer to stay on there as well. So make sure you get Loctite on all of these. Again, anytime you're handling screws near a motor, because there are some very strong magnets there, keep a hand on them. Don't want one of these getting sucked into the motor. It's not fun getting it out. Same thing with these washers. I'm going to keep a hand on it until it's well into the hole. I always feel a little safer once the threads are started here. Okay. Those two are very much loose but started, and then we're going to go to these longer screws here with our finishing washer. And there are 3 per side we're going to put in. Again, we're getting Loctite on those, but not tightening anything yet. Now's a good time to check, by the way, your motor wires should be coming off the front of the motor towards the ESC tray. If they're not, they're coming off to the side. That's okay if that's your preference. But if they're coming off towards the main shaft, you're going to want to redo your motor mount, because that's not going to work. Here, that's one side. We're going to move to the other side now. And we're almost done with the build other than wiring. The only things we really have left at this point are installing the tail pushrod, getting the pushrod guides installed, or sort of getting the pushrod installed into the pushrod guides. Maybe installing the antenna mount, obviously bolting blades on, and getting our battery tray all set. But for the most part, this is the final step of the build, other than a few little finishing details. Then it's all down to wiring and setup. In a minute, we'll set the gear mesh, and I will tell you that there are many methods modelers have for setting gear mesh in these helicopters. I'm going to use mine. You may agree with it, you may not. If you have a strong preference as to how to do it the way that suits you best. GOOSKY doesn't really have any official recommendations other than to make sure that everything's evenly tightened. They don't suggest or not suggest the paper method. Okay, we've got so once you have all 6 screws, just make sure you've got some leeway. You can move the motor back and forth. Mine obviously slides just fine. It's nice to get some more weight in the nose now because the helicopter stops tipping backwards. Now that we've got the weight of that motor up front. First thing we're going to do is just spin the main gear with the motor and just make sure that our teeth are all going in the correct direction. We've got the pinion oriented correctly, which we do. And then what I like to do to set the main gear mesh is to push the motor as tight as I can into the main gear. And now I'm going to let go, stop pushing, and I'm just going to rotate the motor through an entire revolution of the main gear. So now we've gone through a revolution. I'm just going to push it back again and see how much it moves. Didn't really move at all, which is great. So what that tells me is that the pinion is a tight fit to the motor shaft, or I've tightened the set screws evenly. And I don't advocate mashing the motor up against the main gear, holding it in as tight as you can, and then tightening these screws. and I'm just tightening the lowest screw at this point. So I've done a full revolution of the gear after pushing the pinion all the way in against the gear, or the motor in all the way against the main gear. I'm going to do another revolution. I'm going to look at the main gear, make sure it looks like it's straight up and down. It definitely does. And then I'm going to tighten the top. So for me, I'm just pushing it against the main gear, doing a full revolution of the main gear by twisting the motor and then tightening the screws. And I feel like, in my opinion, what that does is it relaxes the mesh. So if there's any point in the mesh where the motor would have been too close, it's now been pushed back to as close as it should get for the highest point on the main gear. And then after I tighten this last screw, I'm going to rotate it one more time. I'm just going to make sure by eye, staring at the pinion, that I have a good mesh here. And let me see if I can show this to you. It's going to be really hard to see, but we've got a good rotation. Let's see. Got good penetration into the gear with the teeth. At no point does it feel stiff in any point in the rotation. It feels pretty uniform, in fact, in terms of the amount of energy to get the main gear to spin. In fact, the drivetrain feels really smooth. One of the things I noticed about the RS7 Ultra, I had the pleasure to watch it fly at the recent Gators Winter Bash Fun Fly in the Orlando, Florida area, was how quiet the drivetrain is. So it's a really smooth drivetrain. That feels great. All right, with that, our gear mesh is set. That's done. We're going to move on to our tail push rod, as well as building our main links. And you know what? I don't like building links, so let's go ahead and jump to that next. Okay, as far as building the main links go, it is a little unclear in the manual what the distance is for the main links. And by that, if you go look back all the way at page 5 where you build the main drive links, this is actually a uniform length for all of the links in the helicopter. It would be great if there was a ×5 here to help you with this, but 70.35 millimeters is the overall length of all of the links in the helicopter. So I'm going to pause right now and build up my next 3 links, and then I'll go ahead and get those installed. I'll come back to you once I have them built. It's just like we did earlier in the build. Okay, only difference with these links over the main drive links is that the GOOSKY lettering should face up on the same side. We're just going to give one side of these a tiny twist to align with the balls on the Swash. We can go ahead and install these. Again, the GOOSKY lettering also faces outwards. So we're going to take our balling pliers and go ahead and get these mounted. The exception to the no 90 degrees will be our elevator servo, which will have, well, the bottom piece will be 90 degrees to the top. There's the bottom half, and the top half will be a lot easier. Here we go. And then last servo on the other side. And these balls are a nice tight, but not too tight fit, pretty much right out of the gate. I don't size these or do anything to them. Once they're mounted, they feel pretty good to me, other than to just kind of, if the angle is a little bit extreme between the bottom one and the top one, this one, I just want to rotate just a tiny bit. There we go. That's better. Great. Oh, there we go. Now we have our drive links mounted onto our swash plate. So we now have all the links. Next, it's time to move on to the tail push rod. But first thing we need to do is screw the ends onto our tail push rod now that the epoxy has dried. Again, epoxy is not called for in the manual. They use CA, but that's how I decided to do it. And I don't screw the ends until the epoxy is cured. So screwing the ends of the tail push rod on now. If you haven't centered your tail servo yet, now is your final opportunity to do so. All right, I just powered up the tail servo temporarily to set center on it. And what I'm going to do now is take our tail push rod and just try and get it in the guides here first. And they have to loosen these. It looks like they don't have a ton of flex. Okay, I've still got these tail push rod guides pretty loose. You can see they swing pretty freely. And I'm going to pop this on the tail servo, on the servo end. And I know I've got my servo centered at 90 degrees with the servo horn pointing straight up. Again, GOOSKY writing facing up. Lots of clicking noises, none of them with the right sound we want. Still not on the ball. There we go. Okay, that's on that side. Now, we're going to check the fit. And this is always a little tricky to do. But we'll turn the helicopter upside down. See if I can show you this on the overhead. Okay, so right now, on the other end of this push rod, I have the servo at 90 degrees, and this is just resting on top of the ball. And what I'm looking at is the angle of this bell crank. I want this line here to be 90 degrees to the boom, and that tells me that I'm centered, that the pitch slider is centered on the tail shaft. So if I look closely at it, if you can see that, I think, let me take a closer look here. Looking at closely, I want this push rod to go this direction a little more. So I'm going to unscrew this by one turn and then take a look at it again. So again, I'm going to triple check that the servo horn is dead at 90 degrees, and it is. And let me show you what this looks like. So now this bell crank is dead on 90 degrees, or very close to 90 degrees to the tail boom. And what that means is that I should have pretty equal travel in both directions on the pitch slider, which is certainly what I want for the Mikado Neo, or excuse me, Mikado Evo FBL. And it's definitely what most FBLs prefer as well. So 90 degrees on the servo, 90 degrees on this bell crank right here. And that sets me up for success when I get to my tail setup. All right, next step is to take our tail push rod guys, space these out. Now the manual gives you very specific dimensions. I think we are perfectly okay to just eyeball this. So I'll spin this so you guys can see okay. And I'm going to put one at the end of the word legend on the back side of the boom here. And just going to start tightening this to the point there's just a little bit of friction that'll hold it there. And I'm going to put the other one about, because I don't want it to go through the lettering on the boom. I'm going to start it just before the R. I can always change the position of these really quickly if I want to. Before I tighten them anymore, I'm just going to move the tail boom through its travel. Just tells me if I have these in the correct position, kind of self-centers them, and then go ahead and tighten these down so that a 2 and the bottom hinge. And then once we have these tightened down, we're going to check the movement of that push rod again, make sure it's at the same ease of movement it was at a minute ago, because we don't want these to bind on the push rod and slow down. And they don't seem to be doing so at all. You should be able to pretty easily, even from the blade grip, move the servo back and forth. Great. Also, take a look at your clamps on the tail push rod. Make sure that, because they're a little tall at some points, they wouldn't physically hit anything. Seems fine on both ends here. Great. We're running out of stuff to do. Now, a couple of extra parts you might have. I've got a couple of short bolts with lock nuts on them. Those are for hard mounting your ESC if you want to do so. By the way, I have a bag I keep for all the parts I don't use that come in a kit on a model. Like I use different servo horns. I went with different dampeners. I just keep it all in one bag. If I ever sell the helicopter, it's nice to include these things. So not going to use those. I much prefer to mount my ESCs with zip ties and double-sided tape so that in the event of a crash, it very easily breaks free. I find it does far less damage to the helicopter and most importantly to your very expensive ESC when you go that route. All right, with that does it for the build of the helicopter. There are a few more details that I will cover, however. We've got to install the hardware in the canopy. We can do that right now. We need to install all of our electronics as far as our Flybarless unit, ESC, and then wire the whole thing up, obviously. What I'm going to do is pause at this moment right here, right after we do the canopy together. I'm going to wire up the helicopter in its entirety, and then I'll give you a video tour of how I did that. There's so many different ways you can wire things up to your preference, but I'll show you how I like to do it in just a moment. And I'm going to go through the setup and then maiden this thing. For the purposes of this video, however, we're not going to dig into setups or maidening. I will throw some flight footage in here. We also need to get our battery on the battery tray. So we'll get that going in a second, but that's super easy as well. All right, so let's get into the canopy and then I'll pause and wire this sucker up. All right, canopy, very simple. And why do we need to do this now? Because duh, we need to test fit the canopy because that's part of life. And we need to install both the front part of the canopy hardware and then the back section of hardware. Now I'll tell you, putting grommets in canopies, one of my least favorite things. I don't have any great tips to do it. It's just one of those things you have to fight through. Okay, first things first, grommets. So what I like to do is do the bigger ones first. Try and slide that slot into the channel so you get at least part of it in. And then when you get half of it in, you can go in on the back side and start kind of working your way around. But these are really thin, so they're fussy. Here we go, there's part of it. But as soon as I get another part, it starts to come off. This is just one of those things that becomes a little bit trial and error-y. And you're just mashing the thing around, trying to get enough of it through the hole that it'll hold stable for a minute, and then you can use your fingernails to kind of work the parts that aren't through all the way. And then I often will get it close and then come around to the back side, and you can see sort of which parts have come through and which haven't, and kind of work it with your fingernail so you get a nice flat disc. Make sure it goes all the way around on this side and a nice flat disc on that side. And then again, always check it from the other side. Make sure both sides look good. This side looks good as well. On both sides. All right, let's look at hardware for the back of the canopy. It's like a two-part affair. You have the quick pin. This is the pin that goes into the cup on the side of the helicopter. This will come through from underneath to the front side. And then a nut that has some grippy surfaces on it that you'll hand tighten. But first we're going to go ahead and get some Loctite on here. And again, you obviously only want that on the threads here. I don't want it all over my canopy, so I'm just going to go ahead and paint it on with the awl here. Make sure I got some Loctite all the way around. It doesn't show it in the manual, but you definitely want Loctite here because you do not want this coming off in flight. So with that post sticking up through, just take your hand tightening nut and hand tighten it. Make sure you don't cross thread it. Just this one really wants to do, there it goes. These are only finger tight, but get them as tight as you can because you don't want any shake to come into the canopy, but the Loctite, once that cures, will stop it from backing out. Here, flip it over, do the same on the other side. And do be cautious where you get Loctite because this push button needs to be able to freely move. You don't want to lose motion in that. So really, you're just getting Loctite on those threads. That's why we use the awl and don't just dip it. Okay, this next lower part of the canopy is another one of those times it's nice to zoom in on the digital manual, but essentially you take the cupped piece. This is what will bite onto the inside. That's going to go on the inside of the canopy. So you'll position that back there. It's then followed by the rubber grommet with the little sort of circular piece that's concentric that sticks up. That goes into the hole. And then the domed piece goes on the outside. And then the screw with Loctite is going to go in from the underside and then screw into this domed piece. So let's go ahead and get that on a driver with some Loctite. So this piece through here, up into the domed piece. And then just tighten that down. You might have to kind of angle the fiberglass a little to get your driver in there. And don't go crazy tightening this, but at least tighten it till it starts to spin this piece. So now what we end up with is this piece here with the channel, which will link into the inside of the canopy, and then just simply do the same thing on the other side. And again, tighten that down until the metal part on the outside here starts to spin. And there you go. Now you can see we've got both metal pieces here. And this means, dun, 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 we can test fit the canopy, see what the suffer looks like. Let's get the whole thing in the frame. So to put the canopy on, you'll split the back half, line up the front, clip the front into those receiving parts, and then line up the bottom of the canopy with those cups, push the buttons in, lock, always give a little tug outwards to make sure it's locked. And there we go. We have ourselves the GOOSKY RS7 ULTRA. We're going to wait to put blades on until we get our electronics installed and test the motor, spool up, and all of that things. So, all right, with that, I'm going to pause here. I'm going to go ahead and get this thing wired up, and then I'll come back and show you how I did the wiring. All right, there we have it, the finished GOOSKY RS7 ULTRA. We're going to take a look at the wiring in just a second. But first, I just want to note how little of the wiring you see from the side, right? So that's it from this side. This is the model from the other side. So all of the wiring is specifically designed to be up high and under the canopy for a really nice, clean look. So when you see it in just a second as I take the canopy off, don't judge, it's all hidden. But before we look under the hood, let's just appreciate how nice this fit and finish is. Canopy looks excellent. I love the white skids, the white details on the frame sides, and the graphic boom. And of course, got to give it a little Rotor Revolution love. If you haven't listened to the Rotor Revolution RC podcast, check it out. Best helicopter podcast on the planet, if I do say so myself. It's me and 3 other guys, and we have a ton of fun talking helicopters every couple of weeks. So check it out. All right, let's look under the hood. All right, we're going to start the wiring tour looking at the ESC up front. So I set up my ESC with the power leads coming out the back. There are these great channels in the ESC plate here that are awesome for getting zip ties through. So a couple of soft Velcro straps, a couple of zip ties on each side brings the power leads to the front. Now my motor leads come out the front of the ESC, wrap around, and underneath the ESC tray, they run underneath, and the motor wires come straight down off the motor, and the connections are in here. You can't actually see it. I also heat shrink the connections since I can't reach them. I don't ever want them to be able to pull apart. So those are tucked safely under the ESC, and then the wires out of the ESC. So these Hobbywing V5s, man, it comes with enough wire in the V5 to, I'm pretty sure you could run it all the way down to the tail. So I actually had so much. What I did is I ran my ESC wire all the way forwards, doubled it back, and then started running. So it then comes up, zip tied to the frame here, up on top of the servos, and then it picks up this servo lead here, goes into the same loom, and it's a little confusing here because we have 2 different looms doubling up and folding here. So we have the main one with the ESC and this servo lead coming in, and then there's another one that picks up the tail servo, the capacitor battery backup, which I wrapped in black heat shrink so it totally disappears. You can't even tell it's there when the canopy's on. It just melts into the frame. So the lead comes up from here with the capacitor backup leads and this servo lead, and is all loomed here. So let's take a look at the other side, and then I'll show you the FBL. Okay, looking at the other side, you can see it's nice and clean on the ESC side. What I did here, these 2 servos are both loomed here. Same thing, way too much cable, so it runs forward first, comes down, folds back over itself before it heads back to the FBL. So it's a very compact frame. So I ended up having to sort of fold things towards the nose and then back towards the tail. So I didn't end up with tons and tons and tons of wire over at the tail. Let's look at the FBL now. Okay, looking over at the FBL now, essentially my looms just come down to about the FBL plate level on both sides. This one comes down and through this hole. By the way, it's amazing that all these frame edges are rounded, but still be cautious and make sure you're protected. And then there's really not a lot of extra cable here. It comes right out of the loom, and it's all set to plug right into the back of the FBL. FBL double-sided tabled. Now this antenna holder is mine. These are the white Mikado ones. I just really like the white ones, so I used one. The one that comes in the kit is perfectly fine as well. It's essentially the same thing, just clear and black versus white. I just like the look of the white ones. One thing I will note about the FBL, if you can, get your FBL more that way. So get it closer to the nose of the helicopter. So the FBL, this edge right here was rubbing on the canopy just a tiny bit. So what I did, I took the canopy, let me split it here, and you can see just a slight relief on both edges of the canopy. And then that stops the canopy from coming in contact with the FBL. All right, that's it for a tour of the wiring. Pretty simple. There's lots of different ways to do this. You could do it along this bottom rail as well and go underneath the main gear. Like I said, there's tons of wire here. You could take your servos forward and around. You can come up with just the servo wire. There's tons of room. There's tons of places where it's really easy to get a zip tie around. Of course, be cautious of your pulley and main gear, and then make sure there's free movement on your tensioner here. I know it looks close here, but there's tons of clearance there. And be cautious of all your wire over the edges. And with that, this project has come to a close. All right, with that, that brings this build video to a conclusion. The GOOSKY RS7 ULTRA is ready to go. It looks amazing. Blade-wise, I went with the Azure 715 Pros and the 115 tails. I like to do a lot of lower head speed stuff, so I like having a little bit of the larger tail size for when I get really low on the head speed. And this helicopter does amazing at lower head speeds as well as at high head speeds. It's a real all-rounder, just a fantastic looking helicopter. Listen, I want to say a huge thank you to HeliDirect and GOOSKY for giving me the opportunity to get this kit before it's released and for an opportunity to do this build and build video. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'll tell you, you know it's a good sign when you're doing the radio setup of a helicopter and everything goes amazingly well. I have exactly dead even travel up and down on my Swash. My tail travel points are exactly the same, 95 points in either direction. It's just a good sign that the helicopter is really well made and engineered when everything starts working out to the best of the mechanical and electronic setup standards that you're hoping for. So really excited to get this thing in the air. Do make sure you check all of your control directions and your gyro corrections before you maiden your helicopters. Please don't build this beautiful helicopter and then mess it up in the first few seconds of the maiden. So have a fantastic maiden. I hope you enjoyed the build. If you've got questions about the build, feel free to drop them here in the comments. We'd love to hear from you all. Or if this video just helped you with something, go ahead and let us know in the comments. We always appreciate hearing from you. With that, I'm Nick Wisdom. That's it for me, the build, GOOSKY RS7 ULTRA. Enjoy. Thanks a lot.